When a man has nothing left, one desperate knock can change everything. A dying child, a stranger's door, and a choice no father should ever have to make. Garrick Hale had buried his wife, lost his land, and watched everything he'd ever built turn to ash and dust. Now, with his 4-year-old daughter burning alive in his arms beneath a merciless Wyoming sun, he had exactly one option left: knock on the door of a woman who had every reason to turn him away. What happened next would tear apart an entire town. If this story grips you from the first word, stay until the end, and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The sun in August 1888 did not warm the Wyoming territory. It punished it. It pressed down on the flatlands like something with a personal grudge, bleaching the grass to the color of old bone, cracking the earth into a mosaic of dry plates that shifted and crunched underfoot. There were no clouds that day, not even the thin, useless kind that drifted through without offering shade. Just a pale, washed-out sky and a sun so fierce it turned the air itself into something that had to be swallowed rather than breathed. Garrick Hale had been walking since before dawn. He was not a small man. 6 feet and 2 inches of him had once been solid, the kind of solid that came from years of hauling fence posts and wrestling calves and splitting wood before breakfast. His hands were the hands of someone who had never been gentle with himself. Wide palms, knuckles that had been split and healed and split again, fingers that curled slightly even at rest, as though they were always waiting to grip something. But the man walking across that prairie looked like those hands had belonged to someone else. He had lost perhaps 30 pounds in the past 4 months, and the weight had come off in the worst way. Not slowly, not evenly, but in sudden drops that left his cheekbones too sharp and his eyes sitting too deep in his face. His shirt had been washed so many times it had given up any pretense of color, settling into a grayish nothing that matched the dust caked across his forearms. His boots had a hole in the left heel that he'd plugged with a folded piece of canvas 3 weeks ago. The canvas had worn through 2 days after that, and he'd stopped thinking about it. None of that was what mattered. What mattered was the weight in his arms. Lydia was 4 years old, and she weighed almost nothing. She had started losing weight before Garrick fully understood what was happening, before he'd recognized the fever for what it was, before the coughing had started, before her small face had taken on that particular translucent quality that frightened him in a way nothing else ever had. She'd always been slight. Her mother, Rose, had been slight too, fine-boned and quick, a woman who moved through a room like she was aware of the exact amount of space she was taking up. Lydia had inherited that from her, along with Rose's dark eyes and the habit of tilting her head slightly to the right when she was thinking. Rose had been dead for 14 months. Garrick didn't let himself think about that while he walked. He'd gotten very good at not thinking about certain things while he walked. It was one of the skills a man developed when he had nothing left but miles to cover. Lydia was limp against his chest. She'd stopped talking about an hour after sunrise, which had frightened him more than the fever itself. Lydia was not a quiet child under normal circumstances. She narrated the world around her in a constant stream. That rock looks like a frog, Papa. Do frogs sleep in winter? Why does grass smell different when it rains? Do you think Mama can see us from where she is? And her silence now pressed against Garrick's chest alongside her small burning body, like a second weight. Her forehead, when he pressed his lips to it, felt like the surface of a stone that had been sitting in full sun. "Still here," he murmured into her hair. "You're still here." She didn't answer. He walked. Oh, the road, if it could be called that, was more of a suggestion. 2 ruts worn into the prairie by wagon wheels curving slightly south before straightening again, following no particular logic except the path of least resistance between rises in the land. Garrick had been following it since he'd picked it up the previous afternoon after crossing the dry creek bed that had, according to the man in the last town, marked the eastern edge of the Cross property. He didn't know much about Eleanor Cross. What he knew he'd gathered in pieces from 3 different conversations, none of them particularly generous in their information. The man at the livery stable in Cutter's Creek had told him there was a widow woman running a cattle operation about 12 miles south. Told him this while pointedly not meeting his eyes, which Garrick had learned to recognize as a sign that more was being withheld than shared. The woman at the dry goods store had been more forthcoming. Eleanor Cross had buried her husband 6 years ago, ran the ranch herself with 2 hired hands, and was, in the storewoman's carefully neutral phrasing, not someone who appreciated unannounced visitors. The third person he'd asked, a boy of maybe 14 sweeping a porch, had just shrugged and said, "She don't run nobody off with a shotgun long as you got a reason to be there." It wasn't exactly a ringing endorsement, but Garrick was past the point of needing endorsements. He had 3 things to offer: his back, his hands, and the willingness to work until he dropped. He had no money. The last of it had gone to the doctor in Millhaven 6 weeks ago, a doctor who had taken the coins, listened to Lydia's chest with a cold disc of metal, and told Garrick in a tone that managed to be both clinical and devastating that the child needed consistent nutrition, clean water, rest, and probably goat's milk if he could get it. "She's fighting something," the doctor had said. "Whether she wins depends mostly on what you can give her to fight with." What Garrick had been able to give her since then had been insufficient. He knew it every time he looked at her. So he walked toward the Cross Ranch with nothing to offer but labor, and he carried his daughter against his chest, and he didn't let himself think too hard about what would happen if there was no door at the end of this road worth knocking on. He smelled the ranch before he saw it, not in a bad way, in the way that meant life, which was something he hadn't smelled in so long it nearly stopped him in his tracks. Cattle, wood smoke, the faint green smell of watered earth. Then, coming over a low rise, he saw the fence line, actual wire fence strung tight between posts that had been set properly, not the sagging, apologetic kind he'd seen on half the properties he'd passed in the last month. Beyond the fence, a windmill turned in the slight breeze. Beyond that, buildings. A main house, solid and square, built from actual timber rather than sod. A barn that looked like it had been repaired recently. The wood on one side was lighter in color than the rest, newer. A water trough. A chicken yard. A kitchen garden along the south side of the house, green and improbable in the August heat. Garrick stopped at the fence gate and looked at all of it for a moment. Lydia stirred against his chest. "Papa." Her voice was a thin thread barely there. "Yeah, sweetheart." "Thirsty." "I know." He pushed the gate open. "We're going to fix that right now." He'd crossed maybe half the distance between the gate and the house when the front door opened. The woman who stepped out onto the porch was not what he'd pictured. He wasn't sure exactly what he had pictured, boss. Probably something harder, more angular, the way people described women who'd spent years fighting the prairie on their own terms. Eleanor Cross was tall, that part was accurate enough, and she held herself with the kind of posture that came from having to be the one in charge for long enough that it became structural. But she was younger than he'd expected, somewhere in her mid-30s, with dark auburn hair pulled back practically from a face that was watching him approach, with an expression that was not hostile and not welcoming and gave him absolutely nothing to work with. She had a rifle, not aimed at him, just held, in the easy, unconscious way of someone who'd been carrying firearms long enough that it was simply an extension of her arm. She held it the way he might hold a tool he'd picked up out of habit. He stopped about 20 feet from the porch steps. "Ma'am," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. He hadn't spoken more than a few words to anyone in 2 days, and it showed. Her eyes went immediately to the bundle in his arms. Not to him, to Lydia. "What's wrong with the child?" she said. Her voice was flat and direct. No warmth in it, but no cruelty either. Just a woman who had decided that getting to the point was the only sensible policy. "Fever. Going on 11 days now." He shifted Lydia slightly. She'd gone still again. "She needs water and milk, if you've got it. Proper nutrition. I've got..." He paused, because what he'd been about to say was, "I've got money," and that was a lie. And something about this woman's direct gaze made him reluctant to start with a lie. "I've got nothing to pay you with right now. But I can work. Whatever you need done. Fences, water hauling, livestock, carpentry. I can do any of it. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for work." Eleanor Cross looked at him. Not at Lydia. At him. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they're trying to accurately assess without the softening that usually comes from politeness. "How long since she ate?" she said. "Yesterday morning. Small amount." "How long since you ate?" He hadn't been expecting that question. That's not the concern right now. I didn't ask what the concern was. I asked when you last ate. Day before yesterday. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression. Not pity. He didn't think it was pity. Something more like a recalibration. Come inside, she said, and she turned back toward the door without waiting to see if he'd follow. Come. The kitchen was the first room he'd been inside in weeks that felt like a room rather than a temporary shelter, and the sensation of it hit him somewhere he hadn't known was still exposed. A wood stove along one wall, a proper one, with a pipe that disappeared through the ceiling. A table, solid oak, with 4 chairs. Shelves with actual provisions on them. Flour, dried beans, salt, sugar, rows of canned goods. A window over the dry sink that looked out toward the barn. Eleanor set the rifle against the wall by the door with the ease of long practice and turned to look at him. Sit, she said, gesturing toward the table. He sat, still holding Lydia. She felt heavier now that he'd stopped moving, as though the forward momentum had been doing some of the work. Eleanor moved to the stove, checked something in a pot, then pulled a cup from the shelf and poured water from a pitcher on the sideboard. She brought it to the table and held it out. Not toward him, toward Lydia. Can she drink if you hold her up? She can try. He shifted Lydia so she was sitting partially upright against his chest, and Eleanor crouched down to Lydia's level. Not standing over her, actually crouching, eye level, and said in a tone that was notably different from the one she'd been using with him. Hey there. Can you drink some water for me? Lydia's eyes opened. They were glassy and too bright, and they focused on Eleanor with the slow effort of someone working against resistance. Who are you? Lydia said. Her voice was barely audible. My name's Eleanor. What's yours? Lydia Rose Hale. Even sick, she'd give her full name. She'd always given her full name, ever since she'd learned she had one. That's a fine name, Eleanor said. Lydia, I'm going to help your papa hold this cup, and I need you to take just a few sips. As many as you can manage. Can you do that? Lydia looked at the cup. Is it cold? Cool enough. Okay. She managed 4 small sips before she turned her face into Garrick's chest and went still again. But 4 sips were 4 more than she'd had in hours, and Garrick felt something loosen in his throat that he had to work to keep from showing on his face. Eleanor stood. She looked at Lydia for a moment with an unreadable expression, then looked at Garrick. I've got a milk cow, she said. She's producing well. I can have warm milk with a little honey in it in 20 minutes. She paused. Your daughter has the look of a child who's been sick too long and not eating enough. How much does she weigh? She was 32 pounds in May, probably less now. Eleanor nodded slowly. And your name? Garrick. Garrick Hale. Where are you from originally, Garrick Hale? Nebraska, before that Indiana. What happened to your farm? He looked at her. Drought took the crops 2 years running. I had debt I couldn't cover. Lost the land in June. He said it the way he said everything painful. Quickly, without decoration. Because drawing it out didn't make it easier and sometimes made it worse. Eleanor walked to the window and looked out toward the barn for a moment. I have work that needs doing, she said. Fence on the north pasture is in bad shape. I've got one hired man right now. Pete Yarrow. He's good, but he's only one person. I had a second man quit last month. She turned back to him. My condition for this work is standard wages, which I'll be honest with you means barely enough to get you to the next place. Room and board for you both. A proper bed for the girl, and... She stopped. He waited. She had the look of someone who'd been turning a thought over for a while and had come to a decision that surprised even herself. And I'd like to propose something else, she said. Something you're free to refuse without it affecting anything I just offered. All right, he said. I want to be her mother. The kitchen went very quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, a hen made a brief, indignant sound. Garrick stared at Eleanor Cross. I want to be clear about what I mean, she said, and her voice was steady, almost businesslike, as though she'd anticipated his expression and had prepared for it. Not legally, not on paper, not right now. I mean, practically. I mean, she calls me that, if she comes to want to. I mean, she has someone who cooks for her and sits with her when she's sick and braids her hair and teaches her things. I mean, she doesn't grow up without that. She paused. I had a daughter. She died. 3 years ago. She was 2. Another pause, shorter. I'm not trying to replace her. I'm not confused about that, but I have all of this. She gestured, a small, almost frustrated movement that seemed to encompass the house, the garden, the whole solid fact of her life here. And I have no one to give it to. Garrick looked at his daughter, burning in his arms. He thought about Rose. He thought about what Rose would say, and then he stopped that thought firmly before it could reach its conclusion, because if he started thinking about what Rose would say, he'd be here all day, and he didn't have all day. Lydia needed milk, and this woman was the door that he'd walked until his boots wore through to find. You don't know anything about her, he said. His voice came out rough again. No, Eleanor agreed. Or me. No, she said again. But I have a fair instinct for people. And I've been watching you carry that child for the last 10 minutes, and I think you're a man who's been trying to hold the whole world together with his bare hands and not doing a very good job of it. She said this without any cruelty at all, just the same directness she'd applied to everything else. I'm not asking you to trust me completely. I'm asking you to consider a practical arrangement that might benefit both of us and definitely benefits your daughter. And what do you get out of it? She looked at him steadily. Company, she said, which is a thing I haven't had enough of in a long time. He said yes. He didn't say it immediately. He sat in her kitchen and held Lydia while Eleanor went to milk the cow, and he turned the offer over in his mind, looking for the angle in it, looking for what she wasn't saying. He was not by nature a suspicious man, but the last several months had administered a thorough education in the fact that nothing came free, and that people who appeared to offer something had usually calculated what they'd get back. But Eleanor Cross had not, as far as he could tell, calculated anything in a self-serving direction. She'd looked at a sick child and made a decision. That was as much logic as he could apply to it. She came back with a cup of warm milk with honey stirred through it, and she sat across the table and talked Lydia through drinking most of it with the same patient, matter-of-fact kindness she seemed to apply to everything. Not cooing over her, not treating her like something fragile, just talking to her like a small person who was currently having a hard time and needed practical assistance. Lydia, halfway through the cup, looked up at Eleanor. Do you have a cat? She said. Eleanor blinked. I do, actually. She lives in the barn. Her name is Margaret. That's a funny name for a cat. She has a funny personality. Suits her. Lydia considered this gravely. Then she drank the rest of the milk. Garrick watched it and said, Yes. To your proposal, I'll agree to it. Eleanor looked at him. She didn't look surprised. All right, she said. Then we should probably agree on some terms. We probably should. You're not my husband, she said bluntly. I want that understood clearly from the start. This is a working arrangement. You work the ranch. I run the household. We raise the child together as best we can figure out how. She paused. If anyone in town asks, you're a hired man whose wife passed, which is accurate. Yes, he said. It is. I'll tell Pete Yarrow you're coming on board in the morning. He doesn't ask unnecessary questions, which is one of his best qualities. She stood. Right now I'm going to put clean sheets on the spare room bed, and you're going to put that child in it, and then you're going to come back to this kitchen and eat something before you fall over. I'm fine. You look like a fence post that's had a bad season, she said. Come back and eat. The spare room was small and plain, and so clean it almost hurt to look at. A bed with a wrought iron frame, a quilt that had been washed until its pattern was a suggestion rather than a statement, a single window facing east. Eleanor had pulled the curtains to keep the afternoon heat out. The room smelled like cedar and soap. Garrick laid Lydia on the bed with the practiced care of a man who'd been doing it for months across dozens of different surfaces. Bedrolls, barn floors, the seat of a wagon, twice just on the open ground with his coat over her. Setting her down on an actual mattress with an actual pillow felt absurdly ceremonious. She was already half asleep. The milk had done something. Even in the hours since she'd had it, some of the glassy blankness behind her eyes had softened into something closer to ordinary drowsiness. Papa, she murmured, eyes closing. Right here. She's nice. Get some sleep, Lydia. Is she going to be our friend? He sat on the edge of the bed and watched her breathe. That was something he did now, watched her breathe, measured the steadiness of her chest, and didn't answer until he was sure she was asleep. Yeah, he said quietly to the empty room. I think she might be. He came back to the kitchen and Eleanor put a bowl of beef stew in front of him without asking if he wanted it, along with a heel of bread that was 2 days old and tasted better than anything he'd eaten in weeks. He ate slowly, because he'd learned the hard way that eating too fast after too long without food was a mistake his body would register painfully. Eleanor sat across from him with a cup of coffee and didn't make conversation, which he appreciated more than he could have said. She appeared to be doing accounts of some kind. A ledger open in front of her, figures she was working through with the quiet, focused attention of someone who'd long since stopped finding the work interesting but had also long since stopped expecting it to be. After a while, she said, without looking up, "You can talk if you want to, or not. Either suits me." He looked at her. "You live out here alone?" "With Pete Yarrow and his son, who bunk in the foreman's quarters." She made a note in the ledger. "And now you." "You said your husband died," she said. 6 years ago, April. His horse went into a draw in the dark and rolled. He didn't come back from it." She said this with the same directness she applied to everything, but underneath it was the particular texture of something that had been said many times, worn smooth by repetition into something that could be handled without reopening. "I'm sorry," Garrick said. "So am I." She turned a page in the ledger. "And you?" "Fever," he said. "Rose. 14 months ago." He looked at the bowl in front of him. "She got sick in March and was gone by April. I didn't—" He stopped. Tried again. "It was fast. I didn't understand how fast it would go until it was over." Eleanor looked up from the ledger. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that wasn't sympathy exactly. It was more like recognition. The specific recognition of someone who knew that particular shape of loss. "How long have you been on the road?" she said. "Since June. 3 months." "About?" She nodded slowly and looked back at the ledger. "You can take the room next to Lydia's. There's a wash basin in the hall. Work starts at 5 in the morning, which I expect you already know." She paused. "You look like a man who knows how to work." "I do," he said. "Good." She turned another page. "Then we'll manage." He slept for 11 hours. He hadn't done that in so long he woke up confused, his body temporarily unable to account for the absence of the ground beneath him, and for a long disorienting moment, he lay in the dark of the spare room and couldn't remember where he was. Then he heard it. Through the thin wall between the rooms, Lydia's voice and another voice answering, low, unhurried. He sat up. Lydia was saying something he couldn't make out. Then Eleanor's voice, clearer. "I don't know, I've never counted them. There are quite a few stars. My mama used to say each one was someone who went to heaven." A pause. "That's a nice way to think about it. Do you think it's true?" Another pause, longer. "I think your mama must have been a person who found nice ways to think about things. That's a good quality to have inherited." Silence. Then Lydia again. "Are you going to be here in the morning?" "I'm going to be here in the morning," Eleanor said. "I'm going to be here with warm milk and biscuits, and I'm going to introduce you to Margaret in the barn, if you're feeling up to it." "I'll be feeling up to it," Lydia said, with a certainty that sounded so much like her ordinary voice, the voice from before the fever, the voice from before everything, that Garrick had to press the back of his wrist against his mouth and hold it there. He sat in the dark and did not make a sound and did not let himself think about Rose, and after a while he heard Lydia's breathing shift into the slower rhythm of sleep. Eleanor's footsteps passed his door quietly, heading back down the hall. He lay back down. Outside, through the small window, the Wyoming sky was huge and black and absolutely full of stars. Well, the morning came cold for August, the way August mornings in Wyoming could. The heat was still coming, but before it arrived, there was this thin, sharp hour where the air had some give to it, where a man could breathe without feeling like he was pulling the heat directly into his lungs. Garrick was up at 4:30 out of pure habit. He washed in the basin in the hall, changed into the cleaner of his 2 shirts, and came downstairs to find Eleanor already at the stove and the kitchen smelling of coffee and something baking. She didn't turn around when he came in. "There's coffee on the sideboard," she said. He poured a cup, stood at the window and looked out at the yard, getting his bearings in the daylight that was just beginning to define shapes. The barn, the fence line, the windmill turning with a faint rhythmic creak, I'm going to need you to look at the north fence today, Eleanor said, still not turning around. There are 3 posts that need resetting and a section of wire that's down entirely. Cattle have been drifting into the pasture the Hendersons lease. She pulled a pan from the oven. Biscuits, just as she'd promised. Pete can show you where. He'll be out here in about 20 minutes. All right. He drank the coffee. It was strong, the way he liked it, and he had a brief peculiar thought about how strange it was that such a small thing, coffee that was actually good, could register as remarkable. What do you need done after the fence? She turned then, holding the pan with a cloth. She looked at him across the kitchen in the early morning light, and there was something different about her expression than there had been the night before. Not softer, exactly, but more settled, as though she'd made a decision she was at peace with. After the fence, she said, I'll show you the list. It's long. He almost smiled. I've got time. She set the biscuits on the table. Your daughter is still sleeping. I checked on her 20 minutes ago. Fever was down slightly from last night. Not gone, but lower. If she keeps the milk down and rests, she should turn a corner in the next few days. She paused. I've had sick children on this ranch before, among the Hands families. I know what improvement looks like, and I know what the other thing looks like. She's heading the right direction. He didn't trust himself to say much to that, so he said simply, Thank you. Don't thank me, she said, and it wasn't unkind. It was just practical. She's a child who needs looking after, and I'm in a position to do it. That's the arrangement. That's all it needs to be. He nodded. They ate biscuits in silence, and outside the Wyoming sky turned from black to purple to the specific blazing blue of a summer morning, and somewhere in the barn, Margaret the cat produced a sharp, authoritative yowl that carried all the way to the kitchen window. Eleanor glanced toward the sound with an expression of mild exasperation. She wants her breakfast. Does she always announce it like that? Every single morning. She stood, taking her cup to the sideboard. She has strong opinions about punctuality. Well, Pete Yarrow was a compact man of maybe 50, brown and weathered in the way of someone who'd spent every working hour of his life outdoors. He had a gray mustache that he appeared to have stopped paying attention to some years ago, and hands that were, if anything, even more beaten up than Garrick's. He shook Garrick's hand in the yard with the brisk efficiency of a man who had work to do and saw no reason to delay getting to it. You know cattle? Pete said. I ran 60 head at my place in Nebraska. No fencing? Set a quarter-mile of it last spring before I lost the place. Wooden posts, wire, both types. Pete nodded. Can you run a post hole digger without it running you? I can. Then you'll do, Pete said. And that evidently was the full extent of the evaluation. He turned and started toward the barn. North fence is a 30-minute walk. We'll take the wagon. What? The north fence was worse than Eleanor had described. Not 3 posts needing to be reset. 5, 2 of them leaning at angles that suggested they'd given up any real structural ambition. And the section of wire down wasn't 1 section, but 2, with the intervening post having actually snapped off at ground level, which meant a new post rather than a reset. When did this go? Garrick said, looking at the snapped post. Cattle push? Pete shrugged. Maybe 2 weeks back, maybe a month. We've had a lot to manage. What happened to the other hired man? Garrick glanced at him. Eleanor said one quit last month. Roy Fitch, Pete said the name without inflection. Heard better wages at the Caldwell operation over north. Can't blame him for going. He pulled tools from the wagon bed with practiced efficiency. Can blame him for going without a week's notice. She manage all right? She always manages. Pete handed him the post hole digger. Mrs. Cross has a policy about managing. She doesn't do anything else. He said this without any judgment, just as a statement of fact. She'll appreciate the help, though she won't say so in those exact words. Garrick took the digger. She seems direct. Most direct person I've ever met. Pete picked up the wire cutters. Some people find it difficult. I don't. I'd rather know where I stand than guess. He looked at Garrick steadily. You seem like you'd rather know too. I would, Garrick said. Then you'll get along fine. They worked through the morning in the efficient, largely silent rhythm of 2 men who both knew what they were doing. Pete was good with wire. He had the particular knack of tensioning it correctly, pulling it to taut without overstressing the staples, that came from either long practice or an intuitive understanding of materials. Garrick focused on the posts, digging and setting with the methodical concentration he gave to everything physical. One post's full attention, then the next, not thinking past the post he was currently working on. By midday, the fence was solid. They stood back and looked at it. "Good work," Pete said. "You too." They drove the wagon back in the same comfortable quiet they'd established at the fence line. About halfway back, Pete said, without particular preamble, "You've got a sick daughter." "Yes." "How bad?" "Getting better, I think. Mrs. Cross seems to think so." Pete nodded. "Her opinion's worth more than most doctors I've come across, for what that's worth." He watched the road for a moment. "She's a hard woman to understand until you've known her a while. Not hard in her nature, hard to read." Garrick didn't say anything. "She lost her little girl," Pete said. "Frances, fever, 3 years back." He said it quietly. "She doesn't talk about it. But you'll see it sometimes in how she is around children. There's something she's trying to do right that she thinks she didn't do before." He glanced at Garrick. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel like you owe her anything. I'm telling you so you understand the arrangement you've walked into." "I think I understand it." "Good." Pete looked back at the road. "Don't take advantage of her good nature is all I'm saying. She trusts people too readily sometimes, and then when they let her down she acts like she expected it all along, but she didn't." He was quiet for a moment. "She deserves better than the hand she's been dealt." "I'm not going to take advantage of her," Garrick said. He said it simply, without any defensiveness, because it was simply true. Pete looked at him again, the quick, assessing look of a man who'd gotten good at evaluating people. Then he nodded once, apparently satisfied, and drove the rest of the way without speaking again. Lydia was sitting up when Garrick came into the kitchen at noon. She was sitting at the table, and Eleanor was across from her, and they were looking at something spread between them. A catalog of some kind, mail order, with pictures. Lydia was pointing at pictures with the focused interest of a child who had a lot of opinions and was not afraid to share them. "That one," Lydia said, tapping the page. "That's the prettiest dress." "That's a very impractical dress," Eleanor said. "I know, but it's pretty." "Those two things aren't mutually exclusive." Eleanor glanced up when Garrick came in. "She's been up for 2 hours. She had broth at 10. She's had 3 more cups of milk with honey." She said this as a report rather than a recitation, just information, delivered efficiently. "The fever is lower." Garrick looked at Lydia. She looked back at him with eyes that were, for the first time in 11 days, clear. "Papa," she said, "Eleanor has a catalog. She said I could look at it while she does her work and tell her which things are nice." "She did?" "I said she could tell me which things she found interesting," Eleanor corrected mildly. She expanded the brief. Lydia nodded, confirming this with the total unself-consciousness of a child who saw no issue with expanding briefs. "Papa, there's a dress with a sash, a green sash. Can you see it?" He crossed the kitchen and looked at the catalog page. There was indeed a dress with a green sash. It was, objectively, a very nice dress. "It's very nice," he said. Lydia turned the page. "And in the barn," she said, with the rapid subject change of a child following her own internal logic, "Eleanor says Margaret has kittens, but they're too small to come out yet, and I have to wait 3 more weeks before I can hold them." "That's right," Eleanor said, still on the accounts. 3 weeks is a long time," Lydia said. "Most worthwhile things require waiting," Eleanor said. Lydia appeared to consider this philosophical offering with genuine seriousness. "Is that true, Papa?" "Pretty much," Garrick said. Lydia looked back at the catalog. "I'm still going to count the days," she said, in a tone that made clear she considered patience and counting to be compatible. Eleanor, without looking up from the ledger, said, "I'll help you count." That evening, after Lydia was back in bed and the ranch was quiet, Garrick sat on the porch steps while Eleanor stood near the railing, looking out toward the distant dark bulk of the mountains. The stars were coming out the way they did in Wyoming, all at once, as though someone had been waiting for the right moment and then opened a door. They didn't talk for a while. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who were still figuring out the shape of the space they were now sharing, still learning the edges of it. Eventually, Eleanor said, "There will be talk." "I know. When people in Cutter's Creek find out there's a single man living on my ranch, there will be talk. She said it without particular emotion. It was another practical problem that required acknowledgement. I want you to be prepared for that. I've been called worse things than what they'll probably call me, Garrick said. She glanced at him. What will they call you? An opportunist. He said it evenly. Maybe worse. They'll say I talked my way into a widow's property. And when they say that about me? They'll say you've lost your judgment. He paused. The specifics will vary. Eleanor turned back toward the mountains. They'll be wrong, she said. Yes, Garrick agreed. They will. People often are, she said. Wrong about things. It rarely stops them from being certain. He looked at the side of her face, the clean line of her jaw, the way she held her shoulders as though braced for something that hadn't arrived yet. There was something in the set of her whole bearing that told him she had been standing braced for things for a very long time. You should know something, he said. She looked at him. I'm going to earn what you're giving us, he said. I'm going to work this ranch like it's my own, because that's how I know how to work. And I'm not going to... He paused, choosing the words carefully. I'm not going to make this into something it isn't. The arrangement is what you said it was. I'm going to respect that. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. Then we understand each other. I think we do. She nodded once and then looked back at the mountains, and they sat in silence while the stars multiplied overhead. And somewhere in the barn, Margaret announced, briefly and loudly, some grievance or another, and then went quiet. Somewhere in the house, behind a thin wall, a small girl breathed steadily in her sleep. The stars kept coming. The Wyoming night settled over the ranch like something that had been waiting just beyond the edge of the firelight, enormous and quiet and in no particular hurry at all. The fever broke on the fourth morning. Garrick knew it before he even opened the door to Lydia's room. He heard her voice, and it had weight to it again, actual substance, the way a voice does when the body behind it has stopped rationing its energy for basic survival and has a little left over for other things. She was talking to Eleanor about Margaret's kittens. Specifically, she was negotiating. You said 3 weeks, Lydia was saying. I said approximately 3 weeks, Eleanor said. There was the sound of a basin being moved, water being poured. How approximate? Lydia. If it's very approximate, it might be 2 weeks and a half. It might be 3 weeks and a half if you keep pressing the point. Garrick stood in the hallway and listened to this and felt something move through him that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite gratitude, but contained elements of all three. He pressed his hand flat against the wall for a moment, steadied himself, then opened the door. Lydia looked at him from the bed with clear eyes and a faintly indignant expression. Papa, Eleanor is being very particular about the kittens. Eleanor is probably right about the kittens. You don't know that. I usually don't, he said, but I'm prepared to assume it. He crossed to the bed and put his hand on her forehead, which was cool. Genuinely cool, not the deceptive coolness of a fever dipping before it surged again. He'd learned to tell the difference. This was real. Eleanor was watching him from across the room, and when he looked up, she gave him a small, precise nod. Just that. Confirmation. He nodded back. It was enough. The week that followed was the first week in many months that Garrick went to sleep at night with something other than dread sitting at the back of his throat. Lydia ate. She ate with the focused, slightly desperate efficiency of a child whose body had decided it was done being sick and was now filing urgent requests for everything it had been denied. Broth first, then soft bread, then actual meals sitting at Eleanor's kitchen table and talking, always talking. The narration of everything returning in full force, what she saw out the window, what sounds the barn made at night, questions about the ranch and the cattle and the mountains and why the sky turned green sometimes before a storm. Eleanor answered all of it, not with the patient, slightly tired indulgence that Garrick had seen some adults apply to children, the performance of interest rather than actual interest. Eleanor appeared to genuinely find Lydia's questions worth engaging with. When Lydia asked why the grass was different colors in different patches of the pasture, Eleanor explained soil and water drainage and the different grasses that grew in different conditions. And when Lydia asked follow-up questions, Eleanor answered those too, until Lydia was satisfied or had moved on to a different subject, whichever came first. Garrick watched this from a careful distance and tried to figure out how to feel about it. The honest answer was that he wasn't sure. There was gratitude, straightforward and uncomplicated, for what Eleanor was doing for his daughter. There was something else underneath that was more complicated, a faint, irrational guilt, as though Lydia's comfort here was something being purchased at a cost he hadn't fully accounted for yet. And underneath that, in a place he didn't examine too closely, something that might have been the very early, unformed edge of a different feeling entirely, which he pushed away firmly and didn't look at again. He had work to do. That was the arrangement. He focused on the work. The ranch had good bones. He could see that clearly. The land was well situated, the water access reasonable, the pasture quality better than average for the territory. What it lacked was maintenance, the continuous, unglamorous work of keeping a large property functional with insufficient labor. For everything that was working, two things were failing. The north fence had been the most urgent problem, but once that was solved, he found the next problem waiting patiently behind it, and the one after that behind that. The well on the east side of the property had a rope pulley mechanism that had been failing for months. Every time it was used, the fraying got worse. Garrick replaced it with new rope from Eleanor's supply shed, then rebuilt the pulley mount from scratch because the original wood had gone soft with water damage. The main barn had a section of roof that was letting water in over the back stalls. He climbed up on a clear morning and spent 4 hours replacing the damaged planking while Pete handed materials up from below. And when it was done, Eleanor came and stood at the barn door and looked up at the work without saying anything for a long moment, and then said, "That'll hold through winter," and walked back to the house. "That's her version of a standing ovation," Pete told him. "I figured. You want actual praise? Go talk to the chickens. They're more effusive." Garrick repointed the stone foundation on the south side of the house, where water had been getting in and beginning to work on the sill logs. He rebuilt the gate on the cattle pen that had been hanging on one hinge. He cleared the drainage channel that ran along the north field, which had silted up and been causing the low-lying pasture to stay wet long after it should have dried, which was rotting the grass roots and creating mud that was hard on the cattle's hooves. None of this was the kind of work that made a person feel heroic. It was the work of maintenance, of paying attention, of noticing what was breaking before it broke completely. But he'd always understood that kind of work. He'd been doing it all his life, first on his father's farm in Indiana, then on his own in Nebraska, and there was a satisfaction in it that didn't require an audience. The satisfaction of a thing done correctly, a problem solved, a system that would run for another season because someone had paid it the right kind of attention. Eleanor noticed all of it. She didn't comment much, but she noticed. He could tell by the way she adjusted the ledger entries in the evening, by the way she'd sometimes come out to where he was working and stand for a moment and look, and then say something practical about the next thing that needed doing, which was her way of acknowledging the current thing without making a ceremony of it. Once, after he'd spent an entire day clearing the drainage channel, swamp work, unpleasant, involving mud to the knee and a smell that encouraged haste, she brought him water at the end of the afternoon and stood at the edge of the cleared channel and said, "I've been trying to get that done for 2 years. It wasn't that complicated. It was that unpleasant," she said, which amounts to the same thing in terms of it not getting done. He was sitting on the bank, cleaning mud off his forearms with a rag, and he looked up at her. The late afternoon light was hitting the side of her face, and she was looking at the cleared channel with the same expression she'd had when she looked at the repaired barn roof. Not exactly satisfaction, or not only satisfaction, but something more like relief. The quiet relief of a person who has been carrying a weight long enough that they've stopped noticing it, and now someone has put it down for them. "I've got a list," she said, "in the kitchen. Things that need doing that I've been keeping a record of." "I figured as much. It's long." "You said that before." She glanced at him. "I wasn't exaggerating." "I didn't think you were." He stood, finished with the rag, and looked at the channel too. Water was already beginning to move through it more freely. You could see the difference. "Show me the list tonight. I'll work through it." She looked at him for a moment with that assessing quality she had, the look that was trying to determine something. Then she said, "All right," and went back toward the house. Lydia was waiting at the porch steps. "Papa, you're covered in mud," she observed. "I am. You smell bad." "I know. Eleanor made biscuits," she said, as though this information would be relevant to his condition, "with the dried cherries. Then I'll wash up fast." Lydia fell in step beside him as he headed toward the water pump. "I helped," she said, "with the biscuits. Eleanor let me stir the dough. She said my stirring was very good." "Did she?" "She said it was competent." Lydia considered this word. Is competent good? Coming from Eleanor, I think competent is very good. Lydia nodded, satisfied. She had developed a clear sense of Eleanor's scale of praise, the small, precise acknowledgments that meant a great deal precisely because they weren't given carelessly. Garrick watched his daughter navigating this understanding and thought about how children always figured out the truth of a person faster than adults did, because they weren't distracted by what they hoped the truth would be. September came, and with it the first suggestion of what winter was going to mean in this part of Wyoming. The mornings turned cold enough to see your breath, and the nights were something else altogether. A cold that was less cold than a statement of intent, a preview of what was coming. Eleanor and Garrick began discussing winter preparations with the matter-of-fact urgency of people who understood that the window between now and the first hard freeze was not as wide as it looked. Firewood, first. The woodpile behind the house was inadequate for a full winter for 3 people and 2 hired men. Garrick and Pete spent 5 days felling and splitting, building the pile higher every evening, the kind of work that left the shoulders and back too tired for much thinking, which suited Garrick fine. Hay reserves needed augmenting. There was a stand of good grass on the east section that Eleanor had been letting grow specifically for this purpose, and the cutting and baling occupied another full week. Canning, in the kitchen, which was Eleanor's operation entirely, but which Lydia inserted herself into with determination, appointed herself the official lid handler, and performed this function with intense seriousness while conducting a running commentary on each jar's contents and relative merit. It was during one of these kitchen sessions, Eleanor at the stove managing 3 things simultaneously, Lydia seated at the table between 2 neat stacks of lids, performing her duties, that Garrick came in from the woodpile, poured water from the pitcher, and heard his daughter say something that stopped him mid-pour. "Mama, which ones are the apple butter?" Eleanor's back was to him. She was lifting a jar from the water bath. There was a brief pause. Barely a pause, just a beat, a half-second of stillness. And then she said, "The ones with the orange lids. That was your idea, remember? You said we needed a system." "Right," Lydia said. "Orange lids." She picked up the next lid in her stack and placed it carefully. "Are we doing the peaches today?" "Tomorrow. Today is apple butter and the last of the tomatoes." "Okay." Lid. "Mama, can I have a biscuit?" "Dinner's in an hour." "A small one." "No. Half a small one." "Lydia." "Okay," Lydia said without particular distress, and went back to her lids. Garrick set down the cup very quietly. He turned and looked at his daughter's profile. The small, serious face, the dark eyes tracking the lids, the unconscious ease with which she had said that word, as though it had always been hers to say, as though she'd simply been waiting for the right person to give it to. He turned around and went back outside. He stood in the yard for a while. The woodpile was in front of him, and the axe was sticking out of the splitting stump, and the afternoon was doing that thing Wyoming afternoons did where the light went long and golden, and the shadows stretched out across the grass in a way that was almost too much to look at directly. He thought about Rose. He thought about how she would have been in that kitchen. She'd have been the one running the canning operation. She'd have been showing Lydia the lid system. She'd have been the one saying no to the biscuit and then relenting on a small piece. He thought about the particular shape of what had been lost and the particular strange, slightly terrifying shape of what was being built in this kitchen on this ranch. And he stood there until he could hold both of those things at the same time without one collapsing the other. It took a while. Then he went back to the woodpile and split until his arms gave out. Eleanor found him there about an hour later. She stood at the edge of the cleared area and watched him stack the last of what he'd split without saying anything. "You heard her," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't ask her to. I wouldn't ask her to." "I know that. She just—" Eleanor stopped. Tried again. "She started maybe 2 weeks ago, gradually. I wasn't sure if you knew." "I didn't." He put the last piece on the stack and turned to face her. "How did it make you feel?" The question seemed to catch her slightly off guard. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who'd been asked something they'd already asked themselves and hadn't finished answering. I don't know exactly. Complicated. She folded her arms across her chest, not defensively, more like she was steadying herself. Like something I didn't expect to have, which is also something I've learned to be careful about. Because things you don't expect to have can be taken away, he said. She looked at him steadily. Yes. I'm not going to take her away from you, he said. He said it simply, because it was simply true. That's not who I am. If she calls you that, it's because she's decided it's true. And I think she's probably right. Something moved across Eleanor's face that she didn't quite manage to contain before he saw it. It wasn't much. A tightening around the eyes, a fractional change in her jaw. Someone who didn't know her face well would have missed it entirely. Garrick, she said. Yeah. Don't make promises about the future you can't guarantee. I'm not promising the future, he said. I'm telling you something about right now. She looked at him for another long moment. Then she unfolded her arms and looked at the woodpile. You split too much, she said. Your shoulders will seize up tonight. Probably. There's liniment in the cabinet above the dry sink. All right. She turned to go back to the house, then stopped. Without turning around. For what it's worth. When she says it. A pause. It doesn't feel like something I'm not supposed to have, that's all. And she went inside. He stood there in the long afternoon light for a while after she was gone, and the woodpile stood in front of him, enormous and solid and sufficient for the winter. And he thought that sometimes a man built things without fully understanding what he was building until he stepped back and saw what it was. The trouble began in early October. It came first in small ways that were easy to dismiss individually. The woman at the dry goods counter in Cutter's Creek, who served him in silence and watched him leave with an expression he didn't have to strain to interpret. The two men at the livery stable who stopped their conversation when he walked in and started it again at a different volume once he was past them. The way the postmaster held the envelope Eleanor had sent a reply to for just a beat too long before handing it over, as though reconsidering whether the transaction was something he wanted to be part of. He told Eleanor about it when he got back from the supply run. I know, she said. She was at the table with the ledger. She didn't look up. It started the second week you were here. The Milner boy. He's maybe 17, runs errands for the postmaster. He told Pete he'd seen you coming out of the hardware store and asked who you were. By the end of the week, apparently everyone who considers themselves anyone in Cutter's Creek knew there was a man living on my property. And? She looked up then, and they've decided to have opinions about it. What kind? The predictable kind. She said it evenly. Mabel Hicks. She's the pastor's wife, which means she considers herself responsible for the moral temperature of the entire county. She paid me a visit last Thursday while you were out fixing the east pump. Garrick hadn't known about this. What did she say? She said she was concerned. Eleanor's expression remained perfectly neutral. She expressed her concern in a great many words for approximately 40 minutes. The substance of it was that a widow woman of respectable standing ought to be more careful about the character of the men she took on as hired help, and that perhaps if I needed a male presence on the property for security purposes, I might consider asking the deacon, Mr. Fairweather, who is 63 and widowed and apparently available. She suggested a replacement. She suggested a solution to a problem I don't have. Eleanor closed the ledger. I thanked her for her concern and showed her the door. Garrick sat down across from her. Is she going to cause trouble? Mabel Hicks causes trouble the way water causes erosion. Slowly, continuously, and primarily by talking to people who will talk to other people. She paused. She's already talking. I can tell by the way the store women looked at me when I was in town yesterday. What are they saying? About you. Eleanor looked at him with something that was more tired than bitter. That I've lost my senses. That a woman alone for long enough starts making poor decisions out of loneliness. That you've probably charmed your way into my confidence somehow. She tilted her head slightly. And about you specifically, that nobody knows where you came from or what you left behind. And in a town like Cutter's Creek, that particular ignorance tends to fill in with whatever people find most alarming. He thought about that. Does it bother you? What they're saying? She considered the question honestly. Parts of it bother me, she said. The implication that I'm not capable of making my own assessments bothers me considerably. The idea that a woman running a successful ranch alone is somehow suspicious because she's still running it successfully with help. She stopped herself. Yes, parts of it bother me, but I've been managing what this town thinks of me for 6 years. One more story isn't going to change what's actually happening here. What if it gets worse than talk? It usually does, she said. That's not pessimism. That's just how it tends to go. She opened the ledger again. When it does, we'll handle it. She said we without particular emphasis, without seeming to notice she'd said it. Just the word, in its ordinary place in the sentence. Garrick noticed. 2 weeks later, Carl Dunmore rode up the main track on a horse that had been ridden hard and arrived at the house with the specific self-importance of a man who considered himself the final word on most subjects. He was the county assessor, a title he appeared to interpret broadly. Broad shoulders going soft, a mustache groomed in a way that suggested considerable time was spent on it. He removed his hat when Eleanor came to the door and did not remove it in the direction of any particular courtesy. More as a formality, he was getting out of the way before the real business. "Mrs. Cross," he said. "Hope I'm not disturbing." "You are," Eleanor said, "but come in anyway." Garrick was at the far end of the porch, replacing a section of railing. He kept working, but tracked the conversation without appearing to. Dunmore went inside. The voices were muffled by the wall for several minutes, and then Eleanor's voice rose, not much, but enough. "My property arrangements are not a matter for county assessment, Carl, and you know that as well as I do." Dunmore said something that didn't carry. "The deed is in my name. The stock is registered in my name. What I do with my own labor and who I hire to help me do it is my business and not yours." Another muffled response. "No," Eleanor said. "I think we're finished." The door opened and Dunmore came out. He saw Garrick on the porch and looked at him with the flat, assessing look of a man running calculations. Garrick looked back at him with no expression at all. "You're the hired man," Dunmore said. "I am." Dunmore seemed to be deciding whether to say something. He decided against it, put his hat back on, and walked to his horse. He mounted without looking back and rode out the way he'd come. Eleanor appeared in the doorway. She was holding a dish towel, which she had apparently been using when Dunmore arrived and had not put down during the conversation. She watched his horse disappear down the track. "He's fishing," she said. "For what?" "Something he can use. Something to take to the circuit judge, maybe. Some basis for a challenge to how I'm managing the property." She looked at the dish towel like she'd forgotten she was holding it. "He's been wanting to buy a section of the east pasture for 3 years. I've told him no 3 times. And having a strange man on the property gives him leverage he didn't have before. That's his thinking." She went back inside, through the open door. "He doesn't have anything. The deed is clean and the registration is current. He's bluffing." Garrick went back to the railing. He measured the next piece of wood, marked it, and said to no one in particular, "People who are bluffing usually find someone to stop bluffing for them eventually." Eleanor appeared in the doorway again. "What does that mean?" "It means someone else usually shows up," he said. "Someone willing to do what the bluffer wants done. Someone the bluffer can keep his own hands clean about." She looked at him steadily. "You've dealt with this kind of thing before," she said. "I've seen it." He picked up the saw. "In Nebraska, when my neighbor's land was being pressured by a buyer who wanted a consolidated tract. It started with county officials and local business people making noise, ended with a false cattle rustling accusation." "What happened?" "The neighbor lost the land. He couldn't prove anything in time. He began the cut. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen here, but you're thinking about it." He finished the cut and looked at her. "I'm always thinking about what could go wrong," he said. "It's not a pleasant habit, but it's kept me and Lydia alive and moving when things went wrong before." Eleanor leaned against the doorframe and looked out at the yard. "What would you suggest we do?" "Nothing right now," he said. "Keep working. Keep the property records clean and current. Document things that seem off. Visitors, unusual questions, anyone asking about the ranch's title or finances." He paused. "And maybe don't make enemies in town faster than we have to." "I wasn't planning to." "You showed Dunmore the door." "He needed showing." "Yes. He picked up the new railing section and fitted it into place." "He did. I'm just saying, pick the battles worth having. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you always this careful?" "I try to be." "It must be exhausting." He thought about it honestly. "Sometimes," he said, "but less exhausting than not being and then having to deal with the consequences." She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but wasn't not one either. Then she went back inside. The railing went in straight and solid. Garrick ran his hand along the length of it, checking for give. There was none. The problem with being careful, he knew, was that you couldn't account for everything. You could see some things coming and prepare for them, but the things that actually undid you were the ones that arrived from a direction you hadn't been watching. The ones that found you when your attention was on something else, something that seemed more urgent or more important, while the real danger was coming from the side. He knew this. He'd learned it the hard way in Nebraska when the drought hit the second year. He'd been watching prices, watching feed supplies, watching the well levels. He hadn't been watching the bank's patience, which turned out to have a harder limit than anyone had told him. He finished the porch railing as the sun went down and the air turned cold with the bite of October doing what October did in Wyoming. From inside the house came the sound of Lydia's voice and Eleanor's, overlapping in the way they did now. Lydia asking, Eleanor answering, the two of them in whatever conversation they'd found their way into since dinner. It had become the sound of evenings on this ranch, as natural as the windmill's creak or the cattle sounds drifting up from the lower pasture. He stood on the porch he'd repaired and looked out at the land and thought about what he'd told Eleanor. Pick the battles worth having, keep the records clean, pay attention to the angles. He was paying attention. What he didn't know yet was that the thing coming for them was already in motion, already decided, already in the hands of someone who had no interest in the truth of the situation and every interest in the story that served them best. But that was coming. For now, the evening was quiet, and the ranch was solid, and through the kitchen window the warm light spilled out into the cold dark of the Wyoming night, and his daughter was laughing at something inside, and that was enough to hold on to. The arrest happened on a Tuesday, which was the kind of specific detail that stayed with a person afterward, not the event itself, which was large enough to fill every available space in the memory, but the ordinary Tuesdayness of it, the way it happened inside a perfectly unremarkable morning. Garrick had been on the water trough, adjusting the float mechanism that controlled the fill level, a repair he'd been meaning to get to for a week. The morning was cold, proper November cold now, the kind that got into your knuckles and stayed, and he was working with his hands in water that had a thin skim of ice at the edges, which was an unpleasant experience he was enduring with the patience of a man who'd endured worse. Lydia was inside with Eleanor. He could hear them through the kitchen window, some project involving paper and scissors that had been generating considerable commentary since breakfast. He heard the horses before he saw them. Two of them, coming up the main track at a pace that meant business without quite meaning emergency. He straightened, wiped his hands on his trousers, and turned to look. Sheriff Dale Coombs was a man Garrick had seen once before, briefly, in the hardware store in Cutter's Creek. A large man running to heaviness now in his middle 50s, with a lawman's careful, watchful eyes, and the particular quality of stillness that came from years of being in rooms where things could go wrong quickly. The man riding beside him was younger, a deputy Garrick didn't recognize, with the tense expression of someone who wasn't sure how this was going to go and had decided to look severe as a precaution. They stopped their horses at the yard's edge. "Garrick Hale?" Coombs said. "Yes." "I need you to come with me." Garrick looked at him. "On what basis?" Coombs reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. He held it out with the matter-of-fact steadiness of a man who'd done this many times and had long since stopped finding it dramatic. "Warrant for your arrest. Armed robbery. The Meridian stage line outside of Laramie, September 14th. 2 men, 1 matching your description." Everything went very quiet in Garrick's head. Not the silence of surprise exactly. He'd been waiting for something. He'd told Eleanor as much. He'd said the trouble was coming from a direction he wasn't watching. But even when you expect a blow, you still feel it arrive. "September 14th, he said carefully. "I was here. I was working the north fence. Pete Yarrow was with me." "That'll be something to work out," Coombs said, in a tone that suggested the working out would happen on his schedule and not Garrick's. "Right now, I need you to come with me. Let me tell the woman in the house, my deputy will advise Mrs. Cross of the situation. She has a child in there, Tira." Garrick said. My daughter, I need... He stopped. He was doing the calculation that a man in this situation has to do very fast. How much pushing was advisable, what the cost of resistance was, what happened to Lydia if he made this worse. I need 2 minutes. Coombs looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, once. Garrick walked to the kitchen door. He opened it and stood in the doorway, and Eleanor looked up from the table immediately. She read his face in about half a second and was on her feet before he'd said a word. What happened? Sheriff's outside. They're arresting me. Something about a robbery in Laramie in September. He kept his voice level and low because Lydia was at the table with paper spread everywhere and had looked up with the alert, watchful expression of a child who knows something is wrong but hasn't yet identified what. I need you to listen to me. I'm listening, Eleanor said. Don't let them see you scared. Whatever you do, don't let them see that. He held her eyes. Get word to Pete. He was with me on the 14th, all day, from before sunrise. He knows it. I know he does. And he stopped. Lydia had slid off her chair and was standing now, holding a piece of paper, looking at him with dark eyes that were entirely too perceptive for 4 years old. Papa, she said, what's outside? He went to her. He crouched down to her level the way Eleanor had done that first day, and he looked at his daughter's face and thought about all the things he could say, most of which were versions of, don't worry and everything's fine, which were things adults said to children when they didn't know what else to say, and which children, in his experience, almost never believed. There are some men outside who need to talk to me, he said. I have to go with them for a little while. How little? I don't know exactly. Lydia looked at him with an expression that was working very hard at something. Will you come back? Yes, he said. He said it without hesitation because hesitation would have been the worst thing, and because he meant it. He intended it the way he intended to keep breathing, as something non-negotiable. I'll come back. She held up the piece of paper. She'd been cutting it into a shape, something that might have been a star, or might have been a flower. It was hard to tell with the scissors having been somewhat optimistic in their trajectory. I was making this for you, she said, for your room. He took it carefully. He folded it and put it in his shirt pocket against his chest. I'll keep it with me. He stood up and looked at Eleanor. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't fully read. There were too many things in it, moving too quickly. But underneath all of it was the same quality he'd noticed in her from the beginning, that fundamental steadiness, the bedrock quality of a woman who'd been through the worst things and had come out on the other side still standing. Go, she said quietly. I've got her. He nodded. He went out the door. Behind him, before the door closed, he heard Lydia say, Mama, why are those men taking Papa? And he didn't hear Eleanor's answer because the door shut between them, and he walked across the yard to where Coombs was waiting with the handcuffs already out, and he put his hands forward and let them be put on, because that was what a man did when the alternative was making it worse. The deputy, to his credit, at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. Coombs did not look uncomfortable, but he wasn't rough about it either, which Garrick filed away as information. A man doing a job. Not a man with an agenda, or at least not obviously. They put him on the back of a spare horse they'd brought and rode out the main track toward Cutter's Creek, and Garrick did not look back at the house. Because if he looked back at the house, he would see Lydia watching from the window, and then he'd have to think about what she was thinking, and that was not something he could afford to carry right now on top of everything else. The jail in Cutter's Creek was a single-story stone building attached to the back of the sheriff's office, with 2 cells separated by iron bars, a small stove in the corner that worked intermittently, and a smell that was the accumulated history of every man who'd ever been held there. Garrick was put in the left cell. The other was empty. Coombs removed the handcuffs at the cell door, which was either courtesy or efficiency, and locked the door with a key that he put back in his coat pocket. Sheriff, Garrick said. Coombs looked at him. I was on the Cross property on September 14th. I've been on the Cross property every day since August 19th. Pete Yarrow can confirm the 14th specifically because we were doing fence work together all day. I'll be talking to Pete Yarrow, Coombs said. Who made the accusation? A pause. That's not information I'm obligated to share with you. Was it Carl Dunmore? Another pause, slightly longer. Not a confirmation, but not a denial in a way that told him something. Coombs put his hat back on and walked out. Garrick sat on the cot. It had a thin mattress of the kind specifically designed to remind a person of the things they'd taken for granted. He sat on it and looked at the wall and thought. The robbery near Laramie. September 14th. He'd never been anywhere near Laramie in his life. He'd come into Wyoming from the northeast, through the territory above Cheyenne, and had traveled south and west to reach the area around Cutter's Creek. Laramie was 70 miles southwest. He'd never seen the Meridian stage line or anyone connected to it, but someone had said he had. Someone had provided enough of a description that a warrant had been issued. That required either a witness or a complaint from someone with enough standing that the circuit magistrate had signed off on it without extensive verification, and in a territory like this, a county assessor who knew the magistrate personally was exactly the kind of person who could make that happen. He pressed his back against the stone wall and closed his eyes, and let himself be angry for exactly 60 seconds, allowed himself to feel the full, clean heat of it, the indignity of handcuffs and a cell, and a crime he hadn't committed while Eleanor and Lydia were back at the ranch wondering what happened next. He gave himself 60 seconds because he'd learned, somewhere in the long, hard education of the past 14 months, that anger had to be acknowledged, or it found its own way out at the wrong moment. You let it have its minute, and then you put it somewhere useful. Then he opened his eyes and started thinking about what Eleanor would do. Eleanor Cross appeared at the sheriff's office before noon. She did not come alone. She brought Pete Yarrow, who had the look of a man who'd been pulled away from something important and had decided to be extremely cooperative about it because Eleanor Cross had asked him to be, and Pete Yarrow's son Caleb, who was 17 and had the same unquestioning competence as his father, and who had apparently also been working the fence on September 14th. Garrick heard her voice through the wall before he heard the specifics of what she was saying. The tone was the thing. Not raised, not emotional in any way that would give Coombs a reason to dismiss her, but carrying an authority that came from somewhere below conscious decision. This was the voice of a woman who had run 1,000 acres on her own terms, and was not prepared to be condescended to about the criminal history of a man she knew. What I'm telling you, Sheriff, is that I have 2 witnesses, a grown man and a boy who was 17 at the time and whose account is perfectly credible, who will both confirm that Garrick Hale was on my property on September 14th from before 5 in the morning until after sundown. They were working fence together. The northwest section. You can ride out and see the work yourself. It's still there. Coombs said something. Then the information your warrant is based on is wrong, Eleanor said, without particular heat, just as a statement of straightforward logic. Either the witness was mistaken or the witness was not truthful. Either way, you have the wrong man in that cell. Another murmur from Coombs. I understand the magistrate signed it. The magistrate signed it based on information that is incorrect. That's not the magistrate's fault, and it's not your fault. It is, however, a problem that needs correcting as quickly as possible, because there is a child at my ranch who has spent her morning asking where her father is. Garrick sat very still on the cot and listened. He heard Pete Yarrow's voice next, calm and deliberate. Pete described the 14th in specific detail. The wagon they'd taken, the exact section of fence, the way they'd stopped at midday because the post hole digger had bent a tooth and needed adjusting, what they'd talked about while they ate. Small, specific, unrepeatable details that carried the texture of real memory rather than constructed alibi. Then Caleb's voice, younger but steady. Then Eleanor again. I'd like to know who provided the description, Sheriff. Coombs' response was too low to carry. I'm not asking you to name them publicly. I'm asking you, privately, as the person responsible for the man in your cell, to consider where that information came from and what that person might stand to gain from Garrick Hale being unavailable to work my property. A longer silence. I'm also going to send a telegraph to the Laramie Sheriff's Office today, Eleanor said, to request whatever information they have on the 2 men who actually committed the Meridian robbery. I'd appreciate your cooperation in making that happen quickly. The voices dropped again after that, and Garrick couldn't follow the remainder of the conversation. He sat with his back against the stone wall and the folded paper star in his shirt pocket and waited. She was not going to let this stand. He'd understood that before the door of the sheriff's office had even opened. Eleanor Cross was constitutionally incapable of letting an injustice stand when she had the means to contest it, and she was going to use every means available to her with the same methodical, patient efficiency she applied to everything else. He knew this about her now, the way you knew things about people after enough time sharing a kitchen and a porch and the long Wyoming evenings. What he hadn't known until he heard her voice through that wall was how much it meant to him. Not the practical fact of her advocating for him, though that mattered enormously, but the simple, unadorned certainty of her presence. She'd come. She'd brought witnesses and a plan and the full weight of her own credibility, and she'd pointed all of it at the problem without hesitating. He pressed his thumb against the folded paper through his shirt and stared at the ceiling and thought about what that meant. Coombs came back at 2 in the afternoon. He came back without the deputy, which Garrick read as significant. He pulled the chair from the desk outside the cell, turned it around, and sat with his arms across the back of it, looking at Garrick through the bars with the expression of a man conducting a private reassessment. "Pete Yarrow's a man whose word I've never had reason to question," Coombs said. Garrick waited. His boy likewise. Raised him right. Coombs looked at the floor for a moment. "And Mrs. Cross," he stopped. "She's not a woman who comes in here and says things she can't back up. I know that about her." "No," Garrick agreed. "She's not." Coombs was quiet for a moment. "The complaint came through the county assessor's office," he said finally, "passed on from a third party, described you by name and by appearance and connected you to a robbery I have a legitimate wire from Laramie about." He paused. "The name and description came from someone who signed a sworn statement. I'm not in a position to ignore a sworn statement." "I understand that," Garrick said. "But 2 first-hand witnesses trump a sworn statement from a third party in terms of what I can hold you on." Coombs stood up slowly, the way a large man stands when his joints have opinions about it. "I've sent a telegraph to Laramie asking for whatever description they have of the actual suspects. If it doesn't match you, I've got nothing to hold you on. And if Dunmore—" Garrick stopped. Coombs' expression didn't change. "I didn't say Dunmore." "No," Garrick said, "you didn't." A pause. "If the person who filed the complaint filed it knowing the information was false," Coombs said carefully, "that's a matter for the circuit judge. It's not something I can act on myself without evidence." He looked at Garrick steadily. "But I'm aware that there are people in this county with interests in certain properties, and I'm aware that those interests sometimes express themselves in creative ways." He took the key from his coat. "I'm going to need you to stay in Cutter's Creek until I hear back from Laramie. I'm not going to keep you in this cell, because I don't have legal grounds to. But I need your word you'll stay available." "You have it," Garrick said. Coombs unlocked the cell door and pushed it open. He didn't step back to make a ceremony of it, just opened it the way you'd open a door to any room and put the key away. Garrick stood. He picked up his hat from the cot. He walked out of the cell and through the office and out into the afternoon air of Cutter's Creek, which was cold and smelled of wood smoke and horses and the particular smell of a frontier town in November that was not quite good and not quite bad, but was emphatically the smell of the world outside a stone cell. Eleanor was waiting in the street. She was standing beside the wagon, not leaning against it, just standing near it the way a person stands when they've been containing something for several hours and are going to continue containing it as long as necessary. Pete and Caleb Yarrow were behind her, and Pete had his hat off and was turning it in his hands, the unconscious gesture of a man who'd just done something that mattered and was still processing it. Eleanor looked at Garrick when he came out. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The street around them had the particular quality of a small town that is absolutely paying attention while doing its best to appear not to. He was aware of eyes, curtain movements, the conversation at the feed store that had gone quiet, the whole town watching to see what happened next. "You all right?" Eleanor said finally. "Yes. You look like you slept on a stone floor." "I slept on a stone cot. There's a distinction." Something moved in her expression that wasn't quite a smile. "I've sent a telegraph to Laramie," she said. "I used the most direct language I could manage while remaining within the bounds of what the telegraph operator would transmit." "What did you say?" "I asked them to confirm whether their description of the suspects in the Meridian robbery bore any resemblance to a man named Garrick Hale of Nebraska, and to respond urgently, as an innocent man was currently being held on a warrant based on false information." She paused. "I may have also mentioned that the county assessor's office had been unusually helpful in facilitating said warrant and suggested they might want to be thorough. Pete Yarrow made a sound behind her that was somewhere between a cough and a laugh. "I have to stay in town until Laramie responds," Garrick said. "I know, Coombs told me." She looked at him steadily. "Pete and Caleb can manage the ranch for a few days. I'm going to stay in town with you." He looked at her. "Eleanor, you don't need to." "I'm going to stay in town with you," she said again, in the tone that meant the conversation on this subject was concluded. "Lydia's at the ranch with Pete's wife, who is perfectly capable. And I'm not going back out there and leaving you in this town alone because—" She stopped. She looked briefly like someone who had said slightly more than they intended and was deciding how to handle it. "Because I still have things to do here," she finished. "Coombs needs to be managed, and the telegraph office needs to be checked. And there are people in this town who need to see me standing next to you publicly." She straightened slightly. "That last part is not nothing." It wasn't nothing. He understood exactly what it was. It was Eleanor Cross, whose name and standing in this county meant something real, choosing to put that name and standing visibly on his side at the moment when it cost the most to do so. She could have gone back to the ranch. She could have let the legal process work itself out. She could have done the careful, self-protective thing that a woman in her position had good reasons to do. She was not doing the careful, self-protective thing. "All right," he said. They had dinner that night at the only boarding house in Cutter's Creek that had a dining room, Eleanor having secured 2 separate rooms with the no-nonsense efficiency she brought to logistics. The dining room had 6 tables. 4 of them were occupied, and every person at every table noticed when Eleanor Cross walked in with Garrick Hale and sat down across from him and ordered supper like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Garrick was aware of it all. He was aware of the looks, the murmured conversations, the particular quality of a room that is rearranging its understanding of something. He sat straight and ate what was put in front of him and didn't meet any of the eyes that were trying to catch his. Eleanor appeared completely unaware of any of it. She ate her supper and talked about the East Pasture drainage. There was a section she'd been thinking about. She thought the approach he'd taken on the North Field could be adapted, and asked him what he thought about the possibility of bringing in 2 more head of cattle in the spring if the finances allowed. She talked about it the way she talked about ranch business on any ordinary evening, with the focused, unself-conscious attention of someone for whom this was simply what mattered. Garrick answered her questions. After a while, he stopped being aware of the room. That was what she was doing, he realized. It wasn't unconsciousness. She was entirely aware of every eye in that room. She was simply refusing to perform for them, refusing to adjust her behavior, shrink herself, add apology to her posture. She was going to sit in this dining room and talk about drainage and cattle, and she was going to do it at a volume everyone could hear, because every word she said was a statement. "This is a man I do business with. This is a man I trust. You can recalibrate your assumptions accordingly." He thought about what Pete had said. She deserves better than the hand she's been dealt. The telegraph came 2 days later. Garrick was at the sheriff's office when it arrived, because he'd been checking twice a day, which Coombs had stopped pretending to find excessive around the second visit. Coombs read it once, read it again, folded it, and placed it on his desk with the careful deliberateness of a man organizing his thoughts before he spoke. "Laramie's got 2 men in custody," he said. "Arrested November 3rd. Brothers, name of Beale. One of them is approximately your height but dark-haired and approximately 15 years younger. The other is shorter and broader." He looked at Garrick. "The description they circulated in September was general. The sworn statement that named you specifically used details that weren't in Laramie's original description." "Meaning someone embellished," Garrick said. "Meaning someone added specifics that weren't available from the original wire." Coombs was quiet for a moment. "That's a problem for whoever filed that statement." "Is it a problem you're going to do something about?" Coombs looked at him with the careful eyes of a man who existed at the intersection of law and politics in a small territory and had spent years navigating that intersection without losing either his integrity or his ability to function. "I'm going to do what I can do," he said, "which is file the Laramie response with the circuit judge and formally close the warrant. What the judge does with the information about the statement's origins is his business." He paused. "I'll be honest with you, Mr. Hale. County assessors in this territory have a great deal of standing. The judge and Dunmore have known each other for 20 years. What I can give you is your name cleared. What I can give Dunmore is a conversation I suspect he won't enjoy. What happens beyond that? He shook his head slightly. I understand, Garrick said. I want you to understand something else. Coombs put the telegraph in a drawer and looked at him directly. Mrs. Cross's conduct through this has been correct, and her evidence was solid. Whatever people in this town choose to think about her household situation, she handled this the way a person handles it when they know they're right. That matters. Not to everybody, but it matters to me. Garrick held his eyes. I'll tell her that. Tell her I said it directly. She'll appreciate that better than if it comes through a filter. Eleanor was in the telegraph office waiting for him. She'd insisted on it, which was not surprising. When he walked in and she saw his face, she stood up from the chair she'd been sitting in and looked at him. They caught the real ones, he said. She closed her eyes for just a second, just 1 second. Then she opened them and said, When are you out? Now, Coombs is filing the closure today. She nodded. She picked up her coat from the chair. She put it on with steady hands. I'll send word to Pete. Eleanor. She looked at him. Coombs said your conduct through this was correct, and your evidence was solid, and he said to tell you directly. He paused. He also said it mattered to him, what you did. She looked at him for a moment with that complicated expression he'd come to know well, the one that was feeling more than it was letting show. Good, she said. Then, more quietly, it should have mattered to more people. Yeah, he said. It should have. They drove back toward the ranch in the late afternoon, the wagon rocking on the frozen ruts of the road, the sky doing the thing it did over Wyoming in November, where it went a pale, colorless gray that was somehow more vast than blue. Neither of them spoke much. Not because there was nothing to say. There was a great deal to say, and they both knew it. But because the particular relief of the moment required a certain quiet to settle into properly. About 4 miles from the ranch, Eleanor said, He's not going to stop. Done more. He didn't get what he wanted. People like that. She stopped. He'll find another angle. Probably, Garrick said. Are you frightened of that? He thought about it honestly. No, he said. Not anymore. He looked at the road ahead. I was frightened in that cell. Not of Dunmore, of... He paused, choosing the words. Of what it would mean for Lydia, of losing the ground we'd found. He shook his head slightly. But sitting in there and listening to you through that wall, I wasn't frightened after that. Eleanor looked straight ahead at the road. That's a lot of weight to put on a person, she said. I know, he said. I'm not saying it as an obligation. I'm saying it because it's true. She was quiet for a long time. The road turned south and the ranch fence line came into view. The north fence, the one he'd repaired that first week, strung tight and solid. Lydia's going to be angry with us for being gone, she said finally. She's going to be angry with me, he said. She understands you were trying to help. She might surprise you. She usually does. The ranch yard came into view. And there, at the front gate, was a small figure who had apparently decided that waiting on the porch was not sufficient, and that waiting at the actual gate was the appropriate measure of the situation's seriousness. Lydia stood with her arms crossed and her chin up, and an expression on her face that was attempting to be stern but was losing the battle against the relief underneath it. Garrick pulled the wagon to a stop. Lydia looked at him for exactly 1 second before she ran. He climbed down from the wagon and caught her, and she wrapped around him with the total, trusting abandon of a small child who has decided that anger can wait and holding on cannot. He held her against his chest and felt her heart going fast and thought about the folded paper star still in his shirt pocket and thought about how a man could lose everything twice and somehow still end up with this. You were gone a long time, Lydia said into his shoulder. I know. I'm sorry. I counted the days. I know, sweetheart. She pulled back to look at his face with the serious, searching expression that reminded him so precisely of Rose that it sometimes knocked the breath out of him. Are you in trouble? Not anymore, he said. She considered this. Then she looked past him at Eleanor, who was tying off the horses. Mama fixed it. He glanced at Eleanor, who had either not heard or had decided she hadn't. He looked back at his daughter. Yeah, he said. Mama fixed it. Lydia nodded as though this was exactly what she'd expected, slid down from his arms, and walked back toward the house with the confident stride of a child whose faith in the relevant adults had been confirmed and who was now ready for supper. Garrick stood in the cold yard and watched her go. Behind him, Eleanor came to stand beside him. Not close, just near. They both looked at the small figure crossing the yard. "She had complete confidence in you," Garrick said quietly. "The whole time. She never doubted it." "Children make better assessments than we give them credit for," Eleanor said. "Yeah." He watched Lydia reach the porch steps and turned to look back at them with an expression that clearly communicated supper isn't going to make itself. They do. The cold settled around them as the day's last light fell away behind the mountains, and the ranch stood quiet and solid and real around them. And somewhere in the barn, Margaret made her nightly complaint about the hour, and everything that had happened in the past 4 days sat between them like something that had been tested and had not broken. That was not nothing either. The week after Garrick came home was the quietest week the ranch had seen since August. Not peaceful exactly. There was too much work still undone for peaceful, and the cold had arrived in full now. The kind that required serious attention to pipes and livestock, and the constant unglamorous management of a property trying to survive a Wyoming winter. But quiet in the sense that the particular noise that had been building since October, the town's noise, the pressure of other people's judgments pressing in from the edges, had gone temporarily still, like a held breath. Coombs had filed the warrant closure. The Laramie response had been entered into the county record. Whatever conversation he'd had with Carl Dunmore about the origins of the sworn statement, Dunmore had not been seen at the ranch or in any doorway Garrick happened to be passing through, and his name came up less than it had. Pete Yarrow, who had better intelligence on the town's mood than either Garrick or Eleanor because Pete's wife talked to everyone and reported back with the accuracy of a military correspondent, said that the general opinion had shifted somewhat. Not in their favor exactly, but the story had become more complicated than it had been, and complicated stories were harder to sustain as righteous indignation. "Mabel Hicks is still talking," Pete told Garrick one morning over the water trough, "but she's talking quieter. That's something. It's the most you're going to get from Mabel Hicks. Take it." Garrick took it. What he couldn't take, what he couldn't settle in the days after his release, was the thing that had been sitting in his chest since the cell in Cutter's Creek. Not the arrest itself, not even the fear of what would have happened if Eleanor's telegraph to Laramie had come back differently. It was something older than that, something the arrest had clarified the way cold air clarifies a view that's been hazy all summer. He had nothing. That was the plain fact of it, and he'd been not looking at it directly for months. He worked Eleanor's land and slept in Eleanor's house and ate food from Eleanor's kitchen, and his daughter was being raised in Eleanor's arms. And all of this had happened because he'd arrived at her door with nothing, and she'd handed him a life he hadn't asked for and didn't deserve on any rational accounting. The arrangement had made sense in August. A desperate man and a generous woman and a sick child. The logic of it had been simple enough that he could live inside it without examining the edges too closely. But it was November now, and Lydia was healthy, and the ranch was in better shape than it had been when he arrived. And he was a man who had come here with nothing, and was still a man with nothing, and Eleanor Cross had put her name and her standing and 4 days of her life into a jail cell situation that was entirely his fault for existing in the first place. He thought about this at night. He thought about it in the cold mornings when he was first out of bed, and the ranch was still dark, and there was a window of private time before the day's demands started. He turned it over and looked at it from different angles, and couldn't find an angle where it came out clean. The decent thing, he kept arriving at this conclusion and kept not liking it, the decent thing was probably to leave, not to run. He wasn't running, but to take Lydia somewhere he wasn't a liability to anyone, somewhere his presence didn't require a woman of good standing to defend his character at a sheriff's office while the whole town watched. He'd built himself up before from nothing. Nebraska had been nothing when he'd arrived, 23 years old with $200 and a land grant and the specific stubbornness of someone who hadn't yet learned how many ways a person could fail. He could do it again. Different territory maybe. Further west, away from whatever Dunmore's reach extended to. Montana, maybe. Oregon. He didn't let himself think about what Lydia would say. He didn't let himself think about Eleanor's face. He thought about logistics instead, which was safer. The money he'd earned since August. Eleanor paid fair wages, always on time, cash or credit against the store account. He had enough to get them to the next place, not comfortably, but sufficiently. He'd need to tell her well in advance. Give her time to find another hired man, maybe two. Write out the list of everything he'd been managing, the maintenance schedule, the fence sections that would need attention in spring. He had this conversation with himself over 3 days, alone, building the case the way a man builds a fence. One post at a time, methodical, not looking too far ahead. On the 4th morning, he went to the kitchen before Eleanor was up and made the coffee himself, which he'd done before, but not often, and sat at the table in the gray pre-dawn with the cup in his hands and the decision already made in some part of him that had finished arguing while the rest of him was still at it. Eleanor came downstairs at her usual time. She saw him at the table, saw the coffee already made, and read something in his face that made her stop at the bottom of the stairs. She didn't say good morning. She said, "What is it?" He looked at her. In the gray light of early morning, she looked tired in a way she usually didn't let herself look. The tiredness of someone who'd been running hard for a long time and had briefly stopped performing the appearance of being fine. "Sit down," he said. "That's not a phrase that precedes good news." "Eleanor, sit down." She sat down across from him. She folded her hands on the table in front of her, which was what she did when she was bracing. "I've been thinking," he said, "that I should go." She looked at him. "Not immediately. I'd give you proper notice. 2 weeks, 3 if you need it. I'd write out the maintenance schedule. Everything in the spring that'll need attention. Which animals—" "Stop," she said. He stopped. She was looking at him with an expression that he couldn't read at first because it was moving through several things in quick succession. Then it settled into something he could name, and it wasn't what he'd expected. It wasn't grief, and it wasn't anger. It was a particular kind of exhausted recognition, as though he'd said something she'd been waiting for and dreading in equal measure. "Why?" she said. "Because I'm a liability to you." "The arrest?" "The arrest was Dunmore's doing, not yours. Dunmore came after you because of me. Dunmore came after me because he wants the east pasture and he's been looking for leverage for 3 years. She said it evenly. "You were convenient. He would have found something else eventually." "Maybe," Garrick said, "but he found me. And as long as I'm here, Eleanor, I'm going to keep being something people use against you. The town is always going to be talking. There's always going to be a Mabel Hicks. You had a reputation and a name before I walked through your gate, and I've made both of them harder to carry." "I didn't ask you to manage my reputation." "I know you didn't. I'm a grown woman running a 1,000-acre cattle operation in a territory that gives women very little formal power to do so, and I have managed my reputation for 6 years without assistance." Her voice was still level, but there was something underneath it now. "Don't leave because you've decided it's better for me. Ask me what's better for me." He looked at her. "What's better for you?" She looked back at him with the directness that was the most fundamental thing about her. The quality that had been there from the first moment she'd walked out onto her porch with a rifle and asked what was wrong with the child in his arms. "You," she said, "staying." The kitchen was very quiet. "Eleanor, I'm not finished." She unfolded her hands and pressed them flat on the table. "I have thought about this carefully, because I'm a person who thinks carefully about things, and I want to tell you what I've actually concluded rather than what I think sounds appropriate to say." She paused, gathering it. "When you were in that cell, I was afraid, not of what would happen legally. I was fairly confident about what I could do on that front. I was afraid of something else. I was afraid of what the ranch would feel like if you didn't come back to it." Another pause. "That was new information for me. I didn't enjoy receiving it, but I received it anyway, because ignoring information you don't like is how people make bad decisions." He was very still. "I have been alone for 6 years," she said. "I chose to be after Thomas died because being alone was easier than being with people who didn't understand what I'd lost or who wanted me to be done grieving on a schedule that suited them. And then you walked through my gate with that child, and I made an impulsive decision that I told myself was practical. And it was practical. But it was also—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened slightly. "It was also the first decision I'd made in 6 years that was about what I actually wanted, rather than what was manageable." Garrick set down the coffee cup. "I'm not asking you to stay out of obligation," she said. "The arrangement was always clear, and you've more than honored your end of it. I'm asking you to stay because you have built something here that belongs to you as much as it belongs to me, and because my daughter—" She caught herself on that word, and for once her composure cracked just slightly, just at the edge. Because Lydia would not recover from losing you, and I would not recover from losing her, and those two facts make your departure something that affects me directly. She looked at him. So, don't go. He looked at Eleanor Cross in the gray morning light of the kitchen that he'd eaten breakfast in for 3 months, and worked toward every evening, and come home to from a jail cell and sat in at 4 a.m. working up the courage to say the wrong thing. And he thought about how he'd spent the last 3 months building the case for leaving while simultaneously, in every practical and actual way, building something else entirely. "I didn't want to be a weight you carried," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "You're not a weight," she said. She stopped. For possibly the first time since he'd known her, Eleanor Cross appeared to be searching for the right words. "You're the person I talked to, about the ranch, about the fences and the cattle and the winter preparations, but also about—" She gestured slightly, the small, frustrated gesture he knew now. "About things I don't talk to anyone about. You're the person I tell things to. I didn't have that before, and I didn't know I was missing it until I had it, and I'm not willing to go back to not having it simply because you've constructed an argument for why leaving is the noble choice." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the ranch was beginning to show itself in the lightening sky. The barn, the fence lines, the windmill. Everything he'd repaired or built or improved over 3 months, every post and plank and wire, sitting out there in the cold morning looking permanent. "I don't have anything," he said. "That's the part I can't get past. You gave us everything and You brought your hands," she said, "and your judgment, and your work, and the fact that every single thing on this property that was breaking when you arrived is not breaking now." She looked at him directly. "You brought your daughter, who calls me Mama and means it, and you brought—" She stopped again, then more quietly. "You made this feel like a home again. It was a functioning property before you came. It is a home now. Don't tell me that's nothing." He looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. Across the table. In the kitchen that was both of theirs. In the house on the ranch that the town had opinions about. And he thought about the kind of woman who came to a jail in a small, hostile town and stood in the street next to the accused man and ate supper with him in a dining room full of watching eyes and talked about drainage. And he thought about all the ways he'd been not looking at Eleanor Cross directly for 3 months while looking at everything else. "All right," he said. She blinked. "All right, I'll stay." She looked at him as though she was verifying he meant it. Then she nodded, once, the decisive nod he'd seen her apply to things she'd settled. "Good," she said. She stood up and went to the stove. "Breakfast will be ready in 20 minutes. You should wake Lydia. She's been sleeping late." He sat at the table for a moment, and then he almost laughed. Not quite, but close, because that was Eleanor moving directly from the most important conversation they'd had to the next practical item on the list. And he understood now that this was not avoidance. This was her version of trust. This was her saying, "We've handled that. Now here's what's next," which was the only way she knew how to move forward. And he found it, at this precise moment, to be the most reassuring thing he'd ever witnessed. He went upstairs and knocked on Lydia's door. "Up?" he said. A pause. Then, "Is it a school day?" "It's a Tuesday." Another pause. "Is Tuesday a school day?" "Eleanor's teaching you letters this morning." "Oh." The sound of movement. "Is there biscuits?" "Probably." "Okay." More movement. Then the door opened and Lydia stood there with her hair entirely sideways and one sock on and an expression of someone who had arrived at consciousness through sheer effort of will. She looked at him. "Papa?" she said. "You look different." "I look the same." "No." She studied him with the unsettling accuracy she sometimes deployed. "Your face looks different." She tilted her head. "Better." He helped her find the other sock. They didn't speak of the morning's conversation again directly for several days. That was also Eleanor's way. A thing had been said and heard, and it sat between them now like something acknowledged, not requiring continuous reference. The work went on. The winter preparations continued. The hay was in and the firewood was stacked and the pipes were wrapped, and the cattle were moved to the lower pasture where the windbreak was better. But something had shifted in the quality of the evenings. The way they sat on either side of the kitchen table after Lydia was in bed, Eleanor with the ledger, Garrick, with whatever repair needed thinking through, was the same in every visible way. What was different was the ease of it, the sense that neither of them was waiting for something to end. It was about a week later that Lydia, sitting at the dinner table between them, reached out and took one of each of their hands. She wasn't doing it for any particular reason that Garrick could identify. She wasn't scared and she wasn't asking for something, and she hadn't just woken up. She was simply sitting there between them, and she had taken a hand on each side and was holding them both while she considered what was on her plate. "I don't like the turnip," she said. "You have to eat it anyway," Eleanor said. "Why?" "Because it's winter, and that's what we have." Lydia looked at the turnip with the expression of someone who had been presented with an argument they couldn't immediately refute but were not prepared to accept. She was still holding both their hands. Garrick looked down at his hand in Lydia's small grip. Then he looked across at Eleanor, whose hand was also held, and who was looking back at him. Neither of them said anything. Lydia ate the turnip. She made her opinion of it clear through the method of her eating, which was the absolute minimum engagement the food required, but she ate it. "Done," she said. She released both hands. "Can I go see Margaret?" "After you finish the rest," Eleanor said. Lydia looked at the plate, resumed eating. Garrick looked at his hand, still feeling the ghost of Lydia's grip on it, and then looked at Eleanor, and she was looking at him with something in her face that was not a question exactly, more like an answer she'd arrived at that she wasn't ready to say out loud yet, that she was carrying carefully the way you carry something fragile across uneven ground. He understood it. He was carrying something similar. That night after supper, after Lydia was in bed and the dishes were done and the kitchen was quiet, Eleanor stood at the window and looked out at the dark yard. The snow had started while they were eating. Not seriously yet, just the first preliminary flakes, tasting the air before committing. "First snow," she said. Garrick came to stand beside her. Outside, the flakes were barely visible in the lamplight spilling from the window, white sparks floating through the dark. "You ready for winter?" he said. "I've done 7 of them here," she said. "I'm as ready as you get." "What's the worst part?" She thought about it. "February," she said. "Not because it's the coldest. Because by February you've already been cold for months and you can't remember with any clarity what warm felt like. The cold stops being a thing that's happening to you and starts feeling like a permanent condition." She paused. "Last February was—" She stopped. "What?" "Hard," she said simply. "Last February was hard. I had Pete and Caleb and the work and the cattle and everything that needed doing, and all of it was manageable, and I went to bed every night in this house and the house was very quiet." She was quiet herself for a moment. "It won't be quiet this February." "No," he said, "it won't." She turned from the window and looked at him with the directness that was always there, that he'd stopped bracing for weeks ago and had started relying on instead. "Garrick," she said. "Yeah. I'm glad you knocked on my door." He looked at her, at the specific face of Eleanor Cross, which he knew now the way he knew the land around the ranch. Not perfectly, not completely, but well enough that its terrain was familiar, well enough that the changes in it meant something he could read. "So am I," he said. The snow fell outside in the dark, quiet and unhurried, beginning to cover the yard in white, covering the repaired fence and the good woodpile and the cleared drainage channel and all the evidence of work done and problems solved in a property that was in better shape than it had been when a desperate man had walked up its main track in August. The lamp burned on the kitchen table. Somewhere upstairs, a small girl slept soundly, one hand probably still reaching toward the edge of the bed where she always slept, as if checking that the floor was still there. And in the kitchen, 2 people who had both lost more than most people ever do stood at a window and watched the first snow of winter come down, and didn't move away from it, and didn't move away from each other, and the house was warm. The winter came down hard in January and stayed, not the tentative first snow they'd watched from the kitchen window in November. That had been a suggestion, a preview. What arrived in January was the real thing, the kind of winter that Wyoming delivered without apology, that stacked snow against the fence posts until the wire disappeared and turned the pasture into a featureless white plain that looked, in the gray midday light, like the edge of the world. Garrick had been through hard winters. Indiana winters, Nebraska winters. He understood the particular discipline of it, the way a cold season demanded that you stop thinking about what you wanted and start thinking about what the animals needed, what the pipes needed, what the firewood supply could sustain against a February that might go on longer than any February had a right to. He understood that the work in winter was not building work. It was holding work. You held what you had, and you waited, and you didn't spend more than you could replace. What he hadn't understood before this winter was how different holding was when you had something worth holding. He and Pete Yarrow were out every morning at first light checking the cattle in the lower pasture, breaking ice on the water troughs, making sure the windbreak was doing what it was supposed to do and that none of the herd had drifted into the exposed sections during the night. It was cold work, the kind that required you to keep moving or lose feeling in your extremities, and it occupied the first 3 hours of every day with a physical urgency that left no room for other thoughts. Then back to the barn, then whatever the barn needed, then whatever the house needed, then whatever Eleanor's list had on it for that day, which was always something. Eleanor managed the indoor work with the same methodical attention she'd always applied to the ranch. Preserves, mending, accounts, the 100 small maintenance tasks that kept a household functional through a season designed to break things down. She'd added Lydia's education to this. A proper daily session at the kitchen table with reading and arithmetic, and the particular patient firmness she brought to teaching the same way she brought it to everything else. Lydia was learning to read with the same intensity she applied to opinions about dresses and negotiations about kittens. She was not a naturally patient student. She wanted to know all of it immediately, found the slow accumulation of letters and sounds frustrating when she could see that there was a whole book waiting beyond the current page. But Eleanor had a method for this. She never told Lydia to be patient. She just moved through the lesson at exactly the pace the lesson required, and somehow made the pace feel like Lydia's own idea. Garrick watched this sometimes from the doorway, coming in from the cold with his hands needing to thaw, and he thought about what a specific skill that was. Not teaching, exactly. Something more like the ability to see another person clearly enough that you could give them what they needed in the shape they could receive it. He'd known people in his life who had it, and more who didn't. And Eleanor Cross had it in a way that looked effortless, and almost certainly wasn't. February came. Eleanor had said it was the hardest month, and she was right. Not dramatically hard, not a crisis. Just the grinding, gray, relentless hard of a month that arrived after too many months of cold and offered nothing in the way of relief or variation. The sky was the same color every day, a flat, featureless gray that sat low over the land as though it had given up any higher ambitions. The temperature didn't rise enough to feel like a concession and didn't drop enough to feel like a proper event. It was simply, persistently, exhaustingly cold. Garrick noticed it in everyone. Pete moved more slowly, not from age exactly, but from the accumulated weight of too many early mornings in the dark and the cold. Caleb stopped whistling while he worked, which was something Garrick had come to expect as background noise. Eleanor was quieter in the evenings, doing her accounts with a set to her jaw that was different from her usual focused expression, harder, more defensive, like a person bracing against something they couldn't quite name. One evening, he came in from checking the cattle to find her at the table with the ledger open and the lamp turned up high, and her finger stopped on a number she'd been looking at for a while. "Problem?" he said. She looked up. "The winters cost more than I projected, not catastrophically. But the hay I had to buy in December because we didn't get enough cutting done before the first freeze." She paused. "Spring is going to be tight." He sat down across from her. "How tight?" "Manageable tight, not dangerous tight." She rubbed her eyes with the heels of her hands, a gesture he'd never seen from her before, and it told him something about how tired she actually was. "I've been through tighter." "What do we need?" She put her hands down and looked at him. "We need the cattle to come through this winter in good condition and the calf numbers to be decent in spring. We need the east pasture to produce well, which it should if your drainage work holds. We need to not have any major equipment failures before the ground thaws." She paused. "And we need Dunmore to stay in whatever hole he's been sitting in since November." "Pete says he's been quiet." "Pete says he's been quiet. That's not the same as finished." She closed the ledger. "Men like Dunmore don't abandon what they want. They wait." "Let him wait," Garrick said. She looked at him. "Whatever he's planning," Garrick said, "he's planning it against a property that's in better shape than it's been in years, with 2 witnesses who've already established my alibi and public record, and a woman who walked into a sheriff's office and dismantled his scheme in front of the whole town. He held her eyes. He waited 6 years to make his move, and it failed. He can keep waiting. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're more confident about this than I am." "One of us has to be," he said. "You've been carrying the anxiety for both of us all winter. I figured it was my turn." She looked at him with that expression he'd come to know, the one that was more than it was letting show. "That's not how anxiety works." "I know," he said, "but thank you for not arguing the point." She almost smiled. It was close enough. The cattle came through February in good condition. Every morning, Garrick walked the lower pasture and counted heads and checked the condition of the herd with the careful attention of a man who understood that the difference between a good spring and a ruined one was often visible in February if you knew what to look at. The herd was sound. The calves would come in March and April, and they would be healthy because the mothers were healthy, and he knew it the way you knew things that your hands and your eyes had told you every morning for months. He told Eleanor this every evening. Not to reassure her. Eleanor didn't need reassurance in the form of empty comfort. He told her because it was true and because she wanted data rather than consolation, and every morning's observation was data that the ledger anxiety was not taking into account. She listened. She asked specific questions. Gradually, through February, the set of her jaw changed. March arrived with a week of temperatures warm enough to turn the surface of the snow to crust and water, and then cold again, and then warm again, the grudging back-and-forth negotiation between winter and spring that the territory conducted every year. The first calves came in the second week of March, 12 of them in 5 days, all viable, all healthy, the mothers managing without significant intervention. Garrick and Pete were out through 2 nights running on the third and fourth calves, respectively. Just being present, just making sure. But the herd was doing what it knew how to do, and mostly it didn't need them. Eleanor came out to the lower pasture on the morning of the 5th calf and stood at the fence and looked at the herd, the new calves finding their legs, the mothers steady and attentive, and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, 14, counting the one Pete found this morning. 15 if the Henderson cow in the south corner drops today like she looks like she's going to. Eleanor looked at the Henderson cow, nodded. 15 is a good number. It's a very good number. She turned and looked at him with something open in her face that she didn't usually allow in daylight, in the practical hours of the working day. "We're going to be all right," she said. Not a question, more like something she was giving herself permission to say out loud. "Yeah," he said, "we are." She looked back at the calves. "I haven't said that and meant it in a long time." "I know. It's a strange feeling. Good strange or bad strange?" She thought about it. "Just strange," she said. "Like a room you haven't been in for so long you've forgotten what it looks like. And then you open the door and it's still there." She paused. "Good strange, I think. Eventually." It was in that same week, on a Thursday evening when the temperature had risen enough to make sitting on the porch bearable for the first time since October, that Garrick said what he'd been working toward for months without quite knowing how to arrive at it. They were on the porch. Lydia was inside, asleep. The sky was clear and the stars were out in the way they got in early spring, sharper than summer stars, more distinct. Eleanor had a cup of coffee. He had his hands around his own cup in the warmth of it and the warmth of the evening, such as it was, and the particular stillness of a ranch at night after a day of hard work that had gone well. "Eleanor," he said. She looked at him. "I want to marry you," he said. "I'm not asking from obligation, or because it would make the arrangement cleaner, or because of what the town thinks." He kept her eyes. "I'm asking because I want to, because I think we're already whatever a marriage is supposed to be, and I'd like it to be that, in fact." He paused. "And because I love you, which I've known for a while and haven't said, and I think you deserve to hear it said plainly." Eleanor was very still. He kept going, because the stillness wasn't a yes and it wasn't a no, and he had more to say anyway. "I know what you lost. I know you built something here on your own, and you don't need me for any practical purpose that you couldn't manage without me. I'm not offering you a rescue. I'm just—" He stopped, tried again. "I'm offering you me, what I am, which is a man who will work this land for the rest of his life and will try to deserve you and will probably fail at that in various ways because I'm not a man who doesn't fail. but I'll keep trying." He paused. "That's the offer." Eleanor looked at him across the few feet of porch between them, and the expression on her face was one he'd never seen from her before. Not the various grades of composed assessment he'd learned to read, not the rare moments of open feeling she allowed herself in private. This was something else. Something that had come up from underneath all the layers of competence and self-sufficiency and careful distance that she wore the way the ranch wore its fence lines. Necessary, defining, hard-won. Something that had been there the whole time under all of that. "You said you loved me," she said. "I did. Plainly. As plainly as I know how." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she set down the coffee cup on the porch railing carefully, and she said, "I love you too. I've been aware of it since approximately November, and I've been deciding what to do with the information since then." She paused. "Yes, I'll marry you." He let out a breath he'd been holding for longer than this conversation. "You've been deciding since November," he said. "I'm a careful person." "It's March." "I said I was careful. I didn't say I was fast." They were married in April, which in Wyoming was still provisional spring, mud season technically, the ground softening and refreezing and softening again, the kind of month that made everything require more effort than it should. The ceremony was small because neither of them wanted a large one, and small in Cutter's Creek meant Pete Yarrow and his wife Martha, who cried with genuine feeling, and Caleb Yarrow, who stood very straight in his good jacket and looked like a young man taking something seriously, and Sheriff Coombs, who came because Eleanor had invited him specifically, and who shook Garrick's hand afterward with a grip that said more than his expression did. Lydia wore a dress with a green sash. Eleanor had made it herself in February, during the quiet evenings when the ledger was put away and Lydia was asleep and there was lamplight and time. Green sash, white fabric, small buttons at the cuffs. When Lydia saw it, she stood in the kitchen in her nightgown and stared at it hung over the chair for approximately 10 seconds, and then turned to Eleanor with an expression of profound vindication. "You said it was impractical," Lydia said. "For everyday wear it is," Eleanor said. "Special occasions are different." "This is a special occasion?" "Very," Lydia considered. "The most special?" "Close to." She wore the dress with the authority of someone who had waited for this moment since the first time she'd seen a dress with a green sash in a mail-order catalog and been told it was impractical. She held Eleanor's hand walking into the room where the ceremony would happen, and Garrick's hand coming out, and in the middle she stood between them and held both, which was not strictly part of any ceremony Garrick had ever attended, but which was, he thought, the most accurate representation of what was actually happening. After, Martha Yarrow fed everyone from a spread that was generous to the point of extravagance for the time of year. And Pete gave a toast that was brief and sincere and contained exactly one joke that wasn't funny, but that everyone laughed at because Pete had delivered it with such earnest commitment. And Caleb ate 3 pieces of cake with the focused application of someone who had identified the most important aspect of the occasion and was addressing it properly. Coombs, leaving, stopped at the door and looked at Garrick. "The circuit judge has the Dunmore matter on his docket," he said quietly. "The sworn statement and its origins. He's been slow about it, but he'll get there." "What will happen?" "Can't say. Likely a fine and a formal reprimand. Maybe more depending on his patience with men who waste the court's time." Coombs put on his hat. "The magistrate who signed the original warrant is not happy about how he was used. That's not nothing." "No," Garrick said. "It's not." Coombs nodded. "You built something here worth building," he said, and walked out. Dunmore received his formal reprimand from the circuit judge in May. A fine and a letter of censure that became part of the county record, which in a small territory where reputation was currency, cost him more than the fine did. He did not visit the Cross Ranch again. He did not, as far as Pete Yarrow's intelligence could determine, make any further approaches toward the East Pasture or the property title. Whether this was because he genuinely learned something, or simply because the risk-reward calculation had shifted against him, was a question Garrick didn't spend much time on. The result was the same either way. The spring was good, the calves were healthy, the East Pasture drainage held, and the grass came in thick and early, better than it had in several years according to Pete, who had opinions about grass that he expressed with the same understated certainty he expressed opinions about everything. They brought in 2 additional head of cattle in June, the purchase Eleanor had been considering in November, and the herd moved into summer in stronger condition than any year Garrick had been there to observe. Lydia turned 5 in July. They celebrated it the way the ranch celebrated things, not elaborately, but with the specific attention that said this matters. Eleanor made a cake with dried fruit and real sugar, which was an expense that she made without discussion. Pete and Martha and Caleb came for supper. Caleb brought Lydia a small carved horse he'd made himself through the winter, which was clearly not the work of an expert carver, but had been made with obvious care, and Lydia received it with the gravity of someone who understood the difference between a thing bought and a thing made. Garrick gave her a leather journal, small, with a proper clasp, bought from the store in Cutter's Creek on a supply run the previous week. "For writing things down," he said. "When you learn enough letters." "I already know enough letters," Lydia said. "More letters, then." She opened it and looked at the blank pages with an expression of serious intention. "I'm going to write everything in it," she said. "Everything that happens." "That's what it's for." She looked at him. "Papa, do you think I'll remember everything when I'm old?" He looked at his daughter, 5 years old, with dark eyes that saw too much and a green sash dress she'd changed into for her birthday, despite it being a Thursday, and therefore not technically a special occasion, and the small carved horse already in her other hand. And he thought about memory, and what it kept and what it let go, and whether the important things survived the years or whether you had to work to hold them. "Not everything," he said honestly, "but the things that matter will stay." She looked at the journal. "I'll write them down anyway," she said, "just to be safe." Eleanor beside him made the sound that was close to a laugh. The summer moved through its long days, and the ranch moved through them with it. There were problems. There were always problems. A calf that needed intervention, a section of fence that a bull had pushed through with the specific stubbornness that bulls deployed against fences, a week in August when the well on the east side threw up silted water and required 2 days of work to clear. None of it was catastrophic. All of it was the ordinary difficulty of keeping something large and living intact, and Garrick had made his peace years ago with the fact that ordinary difficulty was just the texture of a life that was actually being lived. He thought about this sometimes, about what he'd learned and not learned in the years before Wyoming, and what the losing had cost him, and what it had, in ways he hadn't understood while it was happening, eventually given him. He didn't believe that suffering was instructive by nature. He'd seen too many people destroyed by things that didn't make them stronger, had felt himself bending under weights that weren't building him into anything useful. Suffering was just suffering. What you did with what was left afterward, that was the part that had any meaning. What he'd done was walk until his boots gave out, and then knock on a door. What Eleanor had done was open it. The rest of it, the slow, imperfect daily work of building something between two people who'd both lost more than they could afford to lose, that hadn't been inevitable. There was no version of this story where it had to turn out this way. Eleanor could have turned him away. He could have left in November. The arrest could have gone differently. 100 things could have broken differently, and this would be a different story with a different ending, and Lydia would be somewhere else with a different childhood, and Eleanor would be alone in this house through another quiet February. But that wasn't how it happened. How it happened was this. 2 people, neither of them whole, neither of them easy, neither of them remotely what the other would have chosen if choosing had been an option. They'd managed to see each other clearly enough, in the moments that mattered, to not look away. That was all it was. It wasn't fate, and it wasn't magic, and it wasn't anything that romance made it sound like. It was just 2 people paying attention and doing the harder thing when the easier thing was available. The August that Lydia turned 5 and Garrick and Eleanor had been married 4 months. They sat on the porch one evening after supper while Lydia was inside carefully documenting the day's events in her leather journal with the fierce concentration of a child who has decided that a thing is important. The sun was going down behind the mountains in the particular way it went down in August in Wyoming, all that orange and red spilling across the sky like something poured. Eleanor had her coffee. Garrick had his. They sat without talking for a while. "The Hendersons offered for the South Quarter section again," Eleanor said. "I heard. Pete told me. I'm thinking about it differently this time." She looked at the sunset. "If we took it on, it'd be more than we could manage with current labor. We'd need another hand." "We would? You have thoughts about that?" "I have a few names from people Pete knows. Decent men, from what he says." She nodded slowly. Spring, maybe, if the calf numbers are good again. They will be. She glanced at him. You say that every time. I've been right every time. You've been right twice, she said. That's not a pattern yet. It's the beginning of one. She looked back at the sunset. It was doing its full performance now, the whole sky going colors that Wyoming seemed to reserve for August evenings, as if to compensate for everything else the climate put a person through. I used to sit here alone, she said, in the evenings, and watch this. I know. It was fine, she said. I want to be accurate about that. I wasn't suffering. I had the ranch and the work and Pete and Martha nearby. It was a life. She paused. But it was a life I was maintaining. There wasn't much that was growing. He looked at the side of her face. And now? She considered the question with the seriousness she gave everything. Now I have a daughter who is writing in a journal and will probably fill it inside of 3 months and need another one. And a husband who checks the cattle every morning and tells me what he finds, like the data actually matters, which it does, but I didn't have anyone to tell it to before. She turned to look at him. And the cattle are in good condition, and the fences are sound, and we're considering whether to take on more land. She paused. Things are growing. That's different from before. He held her eyes. Yeah, he said. It is. Behind them, through the open door, they could hear Lydia's voice. She'd apparently decided that the journal required narration while she wrote, a running commentary on her own documentation that included second-guessing some earlier word choices and announcing revisions. The sound of it was so purely Lydia, so completely the specific unrepeatable person his daughter was, that it caught him somewhere in the chest the way it sometimes did. Eleanor heard it too. He could tell by the small change in her expression, the thing that happened in her face when she heard Lydia's voice, which was the most unguarded she ever looked, the place where all the composure and self-sufficiency and careful management of how much she showed simply wasn't there, because you couldn't be defended against that particular sound if you loved the person making it. She did love her. That was just the fact of it. As plain and unromantic and real as the fact of the fence or the cattle or the first snow of winter. Eleanor Cross loved Lydia Hale, the way you love something that arrived at a cost so high you couldn't have predicted you'd be willing to pay it, and paid it anyway, and found on the other side that the thing you'd gotten was worth everything the cost had been, and more. The sun finished its business with the horizon and left behind a sky going purple and then dark, and the first stars appeared over the mountains. She'll be out in a minute, Eleanor said. She never misses the stars. No, Garrick said. She doesn't. They waited. The door opened and Lydia came out with the journal under her arm and the carved horse in her hand and sat on the step below them, looking up at the sky with the focused attention of someone conducting a proper inspection. There's the first one, she said. There it is, Eleanor agreed. Lydia looked at it for a moment. Then she leaned back until she was resting against Eleanor's knees. Her head tipped up, and she reached one hand back and found Garrick's hand on the arm of the chair and held it without looking at him, the way she held things she wanted to keep, the way she'd always held things that mattered. Nobody said anything. The stars kept coming out, one at a time, and then in groups, the sky darkening around them, the ranch settling into the sounds it made at night, the cattle moving in the lower pasture, the windmill turning, somewhere in the barn Margaret making a brief authoritative statement about something, then going quiet. There were people in Cutter's Creek who still had opinions about the Cross Ranch, and the people on it. There probably always would be. The world didn't run short of people who needed to have opinions about how others were living, especially when those others were living in ways that didn't fit the expected shape. Garrick knew this and didn't spend much energy on it because he'd learned, the hard way and over many miles, that other people's opinions about your life occupied exactly as much of your life as you allowed them to, and he'd stopped allowing very much. What he knew, what he could see from this porch on this evening in August with the stars coming out over Wyoming and his daughter's hand in his, was simpler than anything the town wanted to make it. You lost things. Sometimes you lost everything. And then you walked until you found a door, and you knocked, and something on the other side decided to open it. And after that, the only question was whether you had the courage to stay. He had been a desperate man with a sick child and no prospects and worn-through boots, and he had knocked on a door in the middle of a Wyoming August, and on the other side of it had been Eleanor Cross, who had her own losses and her own courage and her own very specific opinions about incompetent kittens and impractical dresses and the correct tension for fence wire. He hadn't known what he was knocking toward. That was the thing nobody told you about the moments that changed your life. You never knew them for what they were while you were standing in them. You were just a man carrying his daughter across a scorched prairie, doing the only thing left to do, which was try the next door. And sometimes, not always, not because you deserved it, not because the story was arranged to reward you, sometimes the door opened. The stars were fully out now over the Wyoming mountains, enormous and indifferent and absolutely beautiful. The kind of beautiful that didn't care whether you were watching or not, but rewarded you completely if you were. Lydia leaned against Eleanor's knees and held Garrick's hand and watched the sky. The ranch was quiet. The family was home.